Commission Budget Work Session number 4 in order. Madam Clerk, can you take the roll?
Yes, Mayor Betty Resch,
I'm here.
Vice Mayor Herman Robinson,
Here.
Commissioner Sarah Maliga,
Here.
Commissioner Christopher McVoy,
Here.
Commissioner Kimberly Stokes.
Here.
Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to Juan and to our finance people.
We have the pledge, Madam Mayor.
I apologize. We're going to have the pledge by Commissioner Stokes.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. I apologize. Now I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Juan Ruiz, our city manager, and our finance director, Bruce Miller.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and it's good to see you and everyone. And I'll make it brief because I'm also going to turn it over to our finance director, Bruce Miller, who will handle the introductions and kind of set the stage for tonight's 4th budget workshop, if I remember correctly. And I apologize, I don't have all our gentlemen that are in the house. David with Stantec. Didn't catch your last name, and then your Robert. Ralph. Sorry, I apologize. Ralph. And David are here with Stantec with us, and you guys are familiar with the Stantec modeling, and we're going to run through several different funds, keep it high level. Bruce will also cover a topic on capital, and then we'll also discuss kind of a precursor to the conversation about finance guidelines, that which we've been kind of talking about a little bit in the past meetings about fund balances and financial guidelines, and which will help us. It's more of a moving forward conversation, but also plays a lot into our conversations tonight when we talk about the availability of fund balances and rainy day funds and things of that sort. So without further ado, Mr. Miller.
Thank you. I don't know if this needs to be turned on. As Juan mentioned, what I would like to do is before we get into the operating funds, I'd like to spend a little bit of time just discussing some of the CIP issues, and then talk about a fund balance proposal, policy and procedure I put on your desk for not really consideration for tonight, but as an intro. So with that, later on, David will be going through all the different funds, again, at a very, very high level. But they'll be able to do any of the what if scenarios, especially with the enterprise funds that you may wish to evaluate. As we've been discussing the general fund, we were able to balance through some steps at the appropriate time. I'll go through that one more time. But right now, we'd like to spend a little bit of time and just give you a overview of the CFP and the next steps that we have to take regarding that. As you know, we have not been able to spend a lot of time with the CIP projects. There's an awful lot of information relative to those appropriations and projects. So what I propose is with the enterprise funds, primarily the electric funds, the water fund, the stormwater, refuse, and wastewater, that we go through and appropriate, again, not tonight, but the conversation, we really need to start focusing on the general fund and the governmental funds, because the reality is those governmental funds, we do not have a lot of excess revenue capacity to fund those projects. It's unfortunately the lay of the land. We have 3 potential sources of funds that are either have been and or are coming online potentially. The first one is the sales tax revenue. Unfortunately, that sales tax is basically been committed for the pool. So unless there's a large change in that or appropriations are changed, that's effectively pretty much off the table for the time being. The next one, as you recall, we're talking about a fund for the pension obligation bonds. That conversation, as you may recall, provides for revenue capacity in the first 5 years, which could be used for capital and other purposes. But as you may also recall, there was conversations relative to keeping those funds restricted to the pension plan itself. So that would effectively take off that as an option. But again, I'm just starting out the different options that they promised. The last revenue source in any capacity is the ARPA funds and how we use the ARPA funds. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to really get into a lot of policy discussion as to what those ARPA funds are going to be used for and that in-depth conversation. But if you take a look at this capital sheet that was laid on your desk, it's a summary. And just if you would go down, you turn to page 2, and it says all governmental funds, 3/4 of the way down, almost 7/8 of the way down. It says total governmental funds, fiscal year 22 request of $13 million. And then it goes out every year thereafter with a cumulative request of, over the next 5 years of approximately $28 million. You'll see that we just do not have that capacity in the operating funds. When we go through the operating funds or the governmental funds tonight, you'll see that they are just at break-even point. The levy capacity for the general fund, we're at 9 cents. So there's a one cent differential on that. I should say $8 and $9. We can go up to 10. So there's not a whole lot of levy capacity. There's not a whole lot of capacity in the local receipt, and the pass-throughs from the state/county are pretty restricted also. There's not going to be a whole lot of growth with that. So, and that's basically 2 fundamental options. Unfortunately, the first option is to cut the operating budgets to increase capacity for these programs for capital requests, or it is to use those revenue sources that have been and will be provided to us. So again, understanding it's going to take a lot of discussion. My recommendation again is to go through the appropriation for the enterprise funds and then have a supplemental appropriation in October after the policy directives have been provided to staff to come back and appropriate the governmental funds in any capacity that you see fit. So effectively, I really, there's not a whole lot of other attitude that's before us. That being said, I would also like to give you a little bit of a primer on the, the financial policy guidelines, which are really part and parcel to the same conversation. Yes, sir.
This is Commissioner McBoy. I want to make sure that I understood what you just said, in real clear terms, because I get fuzzy-headed easily. I think what you said was that in this capital improvement program, CIP, for this year, the request is about $13 million.
For governmental funds. Yes.
For governmental funds. And I think your comment on that was, we don't have it.
Precisely.
Can you be a little more specific? Do we have $20,000 worth of it? Or do we have anything worth of it? Or are we pretty much, we're at 13 million of requests and pretty much zero to pay for it?
Okay, I'm
Well-
gonna interrupt here, and I'm wondering, and I'm gonna ask some guidance here from Mr. Miller. Is this it sounds to me like this is a topic that we should have an in-depth conversation at another time other than this multi-level budget hearing. And I don't mean to interrupt Mr. McVoy, but I'm just wondering, I don't want us going down a rabbit hole. We've got so much to cover.
With all due respect, Mayor, if we are talking about capital improvements, that's a big chunk of what we do as a city. We operate the city and we do capital improvements. And
I
we are,
realize that. I'm
budget
asking,
discussion needs to
asking-
have substance. So we need to know if there are accumulated requests, which are probably reasonable requests that have bubbled up from the various different departments. They're not things that people just
and
said, hey. we need
Mr. McVoy, all I'm saying is I'm asking our finance director, is this something that we are going to have a larger conversation? Is tonight the appropriate time to talk about this, or is this going to be the subject of a separate meeting where we can actually dig deeper into it? That's my question to the finance director.
To the mayor, my thought process was, yes, at a future date, when we have more detailed conversations about the policy regarding ARPA and the other funds, at that juncture, have the detailed conversations that Commissioner McVoy is seeking. Otherwise, I think it will be too disjointed of a discussion and not be able to get into the depth.
Well, but again, with all due respect for all parties, I'm not looking for an in-depth discussion. I'm looking for a very general overview. We're roughly $13 million of reasonable requests. I want to have some idea without talking about ARPA and one-off large-scale infusions from outside, from our own finances. What do we have to put towards that 13 million? Anything, $1 million, 5 million, 10 million, nothing?
Which is a perfect segue.
Ballpark.
I understand.
Yeah.
A perfect segue as to why I wanted to introduce, just for introduction purposes, the fund balance policy. The fund balance policy for the operating fund, for the governmental funds, recommends a 25% fund balance level, again, for governmental funds. For the last audited financial statements, i.e. fiscal year 20, we have about $11 million of fund balance. We approximately have, the requirement is just shy of $10 million. However, we're also using about $600,000 or $700,000 of that excess
To pay interest.
well, to pay for some of the capital projects that are going to be recommended. For example, there's a $650,000 request for fuel tanks. We're going to try to spread that across different funds, but the initial source of funding is going to be fund balance. So you may have about $300,000, all right, for governmental funds, or I should say for the general fund. So there's not, and again, I haven't gone through the same sort of analysis with the other funds, but historically, the city and vis-a-vis the very large capital requests, a lot of these capital requests are reflective of deferred maintenance.
Right.
And it's a deferred maintenance that keeps catching up. And we need to build a long-term solution relative to capital programming and what it is that's coming down the pike and how to structure that. We have a road program that really doesn't have a funding scheme. So that is why I'm really recommending a lengthy policy decision relative to available funds coming down the pike. And they're not permanent in any stretch of the imagination. Every one of those are not permanent. So we have to come up with a short-term solution. And what I would say, recommend take advantage of some of the opportunities that are presenting themselves. But also we have to build a long-term structure.
And that's exactly where my question is coming from, is I fully recognize that the funds coming from the federal government, that's a one-shot deal and it's wonderful. We should do intelligent things with them, great. But that's not to pay our annual capital improvement plan needs, particularly deferred maintenance things that we should be doing. And so I'm still trying to get an idea of the 13 million. I think I heard you say that we basically don't have anything.
Now, let me jump in. All right.
I'm trying to understand.
Yeah,
Mr. McVoy, really,
Let me do some clarifying really quick, okay? And Bruce, I apologize.
No,
All right, $13 million is the FY22 request. It's not funded.
I
Okay, within
understand.
that 13 million, there's $6 million that's earmarked for the pool, which is sales tax. Take that off to 13 million.
Okay.
There's $1 million that's been appropriated for the Gulfstream Hotel project. Take that off to 13 million. All right. So those are examples. There's again, this is proposed and it still requires cleanup as this process is fluid. Memorial Park, for instance, we just approved almost $300,000 CDBG that comes off of that 594 as requested, if you recall the last commission item.
Right.
So there's still a true up, but I think Bruce's point, the overall arching point is on an annual basis, we have capital needs that far exceed our ability to pay for. A lot of it's basically deferred maintenance and related to maintenance on either structures or parks, without getting even into the utility side of the house, that things have been, deferred and kind of punted down the road to a time being. So, Bruce, can we just clarify that part of it is a total request for 13 million, but some of this stuff is appropriated either through sales tax funding on the pool instance, or we would say the ability to borrow against, right? And then the Gulfstream, we've already addressed the Gulfstream capital.
well, the $6 million has not been appropriated.
Officially, but we have the ability, so $6 million is there, okay? We have the ability to leverage against the sales tax money
Right.
to do the 6 million. The $1 million has been appropriated for the Gulfstream project. Okay, so let's not lose, get into the weeds too far on each specific project. The fact is that we have millions of dollars in deferred maintenance needs. And by establishing fund balance policies, we can prevent this from happening in out years. Okay, so we can have more of a strategic approach and an understanding of grappling with and dealing with our priorities. And then as you remember, we're also landlords. So we have we have lease requirements to repair certain things on buildings that are occupied by other entities that we've agreed, to bear the burden for certain types of repairs. Maybe it's HVAC, you see chillers, you see roof replacements as well.
Some of that's for the police department, I believe.
Some of it, all of it is for buildings that we own. Okay, it could be Compass, it could be PBSO, it could be the Osborne Center, it could be the gymnasium, it could be the casino building. Okay, at the end of the day, there's structures that we own and there's leases and we have obligations for those leases.
Madam Mayor, it's Commissioner Maliga. I have my light on. Just to kind of go back and to maybe give some clarity to, for Mr. McVoy, out of a 13.3 request for government funds, if you used all the fund balance, the grants, and the $6 million that we have earmarked, if you will, for penny sales tax, just to kind of give you some clarity, you have 6.335 million plus another 6 million in sales tax. So that's around 12 million and change. But that's using everything that we have. That's the fund balance, that's pay as you go, that's all the incoming that we're trying to put, but that's only for 1 year, correct?
So for only 1 year.
Correct.
And yeah.
That's wiping out everything is essentially,
Exactly.
correct.
Which is fiscally imprudent.
But 2.5 million of that is fund balance. The rest is grant money and sales tax money.
Right. And as an example, to add to Commissioner Maliga's comments, I mean, just looking at the cemetery, there's $1.3 million in project requests alone, just in the cemetery, so we have the difficult challenge of trying to prioritize, when we can fund certain projects that we know need, certain capital projects that have to get funded eventually. is it a pressing issue to create a mausoleum this year versus dealing with our priorities of HVAC systems, roof replacement, elevator cabs, things that we consider, this, no pun, life safety issues, right? So again, over a 5-year period, and again, getting back to what Bruce is referring to, is establishing fund balance guideline. So we stop finding ourselves year to year to year trying to claw away and nitpick, just do a little bit here, a little bit there. We have the ability through other funding sources, finally, whether it's ARPA, maybe there's another infrastructure related pot of money that's coming. It sounds like we're going to, really make a commitment of going after various types of grants and in a major way, that it's prudent for us to stop looking at things just in 1 year's time. And that's what we've done here. Mainly out of, lack of resources as we try to build a tax base. And luckily we've had 5 or 6 consecutive years of property tax increases. So we're seeing some of the fruits of that labor, but don't lose sight of the forest. We're still in the millions of dollars underfunded of taking care of our bare necessities on the capital side of the house. All right. And a lot of the capital things you see on this paper are things that we have to do: roads, sidewalks, power, water, sewer. All right. These are things that are have tos, not want tos. There's no, okay, we'll get into the want to kind of stuff when we start talking about programmatic, budgets and whatnot. But I don't want us to, get lost too far in the details and lose the purpose of, what we're trying to establish here, around establishing these financial guidelines as we move forward.
And I think, and I'm just going to add one thing. I mean, again, we talked about it the other day, this is the commission that's going to sort of take the bull by the horns and actually identify what needs to be done, rather than, we are the sad recipients of many, many years of deferred maintenance. Not that people have been spending wildly in the past, but the time has come to face some of these facts and deal with them.
So I appreciate the policy side of this discussion tonight, but when are we going to talk about the specifics of what we're going to spend?
Well, we're going to set time. We're going to set a workshop.
When?
Well,
I mean, seriously, when? Because we're talking about a budget, and then we're going to have a budget by the end of this month, and we still haven't talked about how we're going to spend and what we're going to save.
Well,
So I don't need to talk about it tonight, but at some point we need to set a date to talk about it.
and I think we
Putting
can
that
certainly,
off.
and I think we can certainly,
Different
certainly set a time. I think Juan can work with the staff and with us to set a time, as soon as possible. We've not been putting it off. This is just the next step for us to talk about. So I would say probably sometime late September, early October. Does that make sense, Juan?
Yes, Madam Mayor.
So won't we have to have a final budget sometime in September?
okay. There's 2 steps with this conversation.
Thank you.
The first step is, and I'm just talking capital specific. We're going to have 2 public hearings, and you're going to adopt the operating budget, and you're going to adopt the capital budget for the enterprise funds. Then shortly thereafter, late September, early October, we'll have the policy question relative to all the funding sources that we've talked about and come up with a forward appropriation in the capital program. And then so I'm hoping by mid to late October, you're going to have a supplemental budget appropriation for the remaining capital for the governmental funds. Which again, a city can always do a supplemental appropriation, and that's all that capital appropriation would be, is a supplemental appropriation.
Or decide not to spend somewhere. You talk
Right, but
about.
we'll have that meeting. We'll have that meeting. We'll have that conversation, and at a time when that's what we're focused on. I think tonight we really just need to keep going forward.
Yeah, and let me simplify real quick, if I may, Madam Mayor, to Commissioner Robinson's question. is in the general fund side of the capital program, which is basically things that affect leisure services and public works. There is no money to go around, okay? Unless it's life safety, and those are conversations that we're discussing internally, you know, of absolute emergency to have to get done this fiscal year in 22, they're going to get deferred to 23. All right, if it's not life safety, and we'll talk about fuel tanks, I think, later. Okay, emergency repairs that have to happen in this proposed fiscal year, there is no other pots of money.
Right.
Okay, there is no money, guys, to do capital. Unless you want to start talking about ARPA. Okay. If it's rate based, which is enterprise, then there's some flexibility. You know, we'll get into those slides, electric, stormwater, refuse. And have you guys seen, we talked this past week about the need to raise capital, okay, in an enterprise fund in order to accomplish capital. All right. So the moral of the story is in the general fund side of the capital program, we're still lagging significantly behind in being able to address our basic capital needs. ARPA just happens to be a potential way to get at some of this stuff. And then we'll have that conversation with ARPA and how we want to use those funds in the coming months. Because remember, 5 months in office, drinking by a fire hydrant, everything was coming super fast. All right. In a perfect world, we would have had ARPA already addressed. We just got her in a local agreement last week. Okay. So, but let's not miss the point in Commissioner Robinson. This first column, essentially in these first 2 pages, with the exception of what's been appropriated already for the Gulf Stream and, you know, and the possibility for the pool, there is no pot.
Well, there's grants, there's pay as you go. I mean, there's funding over there.
Again,
You have to balance it off.
Right, but pay-go
Right.
insinuates that, in as far as the general fund, you're going to tap into the general fund balance to pay-go.
Right.
Okay, unlike the beach fund or their electric utility that has the ability for fund balance to have pay-go.
Well, more specifically, PAYGO's current revenues,
Right.
current year revenues over expenditures.
So speaking of current year, I mean, I'm not trying to be devil's advocate, but I'm in August and I still don't see numbers from last year. In a finance world, I don't know how I can make decisions on how to run the city when I still don't see numbers from 2020 and we're halfway through 2021. We're more than halfway. I mean, I've been asking for those numbers since I got here in March.
Understood?
Okay, but it's August.
And an audit.
So, I mean, even the FAB board, I spoke to some of the people and they're like, you know, our first day, our question is, well, what happened with the last year's numbers? And I'm like, yeah, we still don't have them. That is my bigger concern. I understand with all due respect, Mr. McVoy's a question with the CIP, but I'm still looking at making decisions for this budget and trying to see what decisions were made and where that money came from in a pandemic year, how we did to be able to make decisions for the future of the city. So why are we still looking at August and we still don't have numbers? Solid numbers. Books are paid. I mean, I got an email the other day that there were 2 outstanding invoices from last year that had to be paid.
Yeah, no, that's just, that's a legal issue. I cannot pay bills that come in late from a vendor with current year
No,
revenue.
but I'm saying, so I mean, if we got those bills from last year because they weren't paid, where are we with the final numbers for this year?
Were not paid because we did not receive them.
Which I understand what I'm saying. How do we, again, if we would have had the numbers from 2020, maybe we would have caught that those facts that those bills were never submitted because we were expecting them,
No,
I'm sure.
that would never occur.
That's scary.
And let me,
Well,
Commissioner, I got it. Commissioner Milligan, and appreciate the comment. We can, it's frustrating for all of us, finance staff included, that we're still grappling with and much closer to the end of getting our audited financials. All right, for FY20. And that will, and we should have those in the next week or 2. Okay. Capital side of the house, even though our audit financials are important, many of these projects have been rollovers. Okay, we know what the cost of some of this stuff are. We know the cost of replacing the windows and the dugouts and the lights at the parks and the elevator cabs and whatnot. I'm not being dismissive of the lateness of the audit, but we all know the story of the amount of turnover that we've had to grapple with upstairs.
I understand that, but since March, I've been asking, we're now in August, you guys. And I mean, I'm not pointing any fingers. I just realistically, how does a municipality run when we don't know where we were last year? And I mean, there's my little frustration. I mean, I can scrunch these numbers and try to find more money and do everything that we're doing. But again,
And
It's,
the audit,
it's the end of August. I would like to see our audited numbers by September 15th.
and the audit is a contract.
So, I mean, it's just to the point where we should never be in September looking at numbers from when we closed books a year ago.
I cannot argue with anything that you have said.
So September 15th, can we make that our deadline?
We've been pushing a deadline and a deadline.
But where does the responsibility lie? Is it one certain department? Is it faulty software? Like what is the reason if we have everybody working together within the confines of a small office, where does the responsibility, why don't we have them?
The reason we do not have them is because years of neglect. And what I mean by years of neglect is, number one, the city did not have sufficient staffing. The city did not have sufficient operational flows. So you would get into a sequence of events that you would get through budget, and then everybody would shift to the audit and try to do a year's worth plus of reconciliations that never occurred during the year. So to get the prior year audit done, they would, again, drop everything, focus on that audit. This is not, the fact that we have had late audits has been going for probably about 5 years.
Which seems to me we should have either hired an emergency team to come in and help us get caught up so we could start
I can
with
tell you
good
this,
footing.
There is nothing that you have said that we did not try.
So we've had an emergency team
We've
come
had
in.
people come in, try to help. I've had many people come in, try to help. You know, I'm not to discount what you're saying, but you have to understand something. I've been doing municipal finance as a director since 1990.
I know you have, and I respect that.
Okay. And before that, I helped with, I was a vice president of finance for banks and spent 4 years helping with the thrift takeover and closing banks. I understand the very importance of, and I have done everything I possibly could do to get these books closed. I am frustrated.
That's what I'm saying. Do we need to hire more people?
No, it's not right now. I'm not going. It is behind us. You look at the team upstairs. You have a very competent deputy director, assistant finance director, who has external audit experience. Okay, he has spent extra time trying to get the numbers accurate. You know, we'll peel back a reconciliation, and the reconciliation from the prior year is wrong. And then, lo and behold, the system, the IT system, and this is not a disparaging mark on the IT department, but they were debiting and crediting the same account. So the net effect was zero on the accounts. Okay, so years and years and years. Now, what happened was they had a little workaround. So that when the people left, so too did the knowledge of the workaround. So the current staff didn't know what this little workaround is, and they had to go back that piece, which sometimes takes weeks, sometimes takes months. We've had implementations, right, wrong, and differently, all for the right reasons, but they weren't implemented with finance and the implementing departments, so that numbers were supposed to be going to the right accounts. You lay in all this stuff, and the amount of work and effort that has gone into correcting this. We're very fortunate to have the team that we do have today. We're finally to a point that, you know, again, you know, I talked to a guy this afternoon. I talked to him 3 times a day. Where's the audit? Where's the audit? Where's the audit? Is there anything that we need to do? What is going on? You know, not in, you know, a conflictual way,
Right.
but what is it that we need to do to get this thing over the end line? You know, everybody upstairs is walking on pins and needles. And no disrespect to you, Commissioner, but when they hear you push like this,
I'm not pushing, I'm asking.
I'm just gonna say.
You haven't heard me push yet. I'm asking.
But when they hear this kind of conversation, they wonder if they're gonna have a job tomorrow.
Of course they're gonna have a job. I'm asking, what do you need to make it work is my question. Do we need better software? Do we need more help for our team? Like, what is it that, we weren't sitting here for years? Because 2 or 3 years ago, we would have, if I had this conversation with you from this seat, I would have said, okay, I can see that our finance department's frustrated. We need to find ways to make it easier on them and help them get through this.
I have never had a situation where we bring in people that have a resume and they say, yes, we can, and they go through a headhunter. So we have an extra there, okay, and we try to build a team. And then we say, here, reconcile X, Y, Z, and they can't reconcile. The workforce, I don't know if it's a local South Florida issue, but we do not have the resources. We do not have the staffing. I mean, I've outreached to everybody I could outreach to. 2 years ago, we outreached to the Florida GFOA and try to pull some people in through the Florida GFOA, retired people and those kind of people, all right? We worked with the external auditor, another external auditor, not even our own external auditor, okay, to get that report out. You know, we've tried many different things, but the end of the day is, and quite honestly, Lon and Mike were very, very supportive of spending dollars to get this done, okay? It hasn't been through the lack of effort. It's just taken a long time to get the right people in the right positions that understand municipal finance. And always, quite honestly, sharing with you, I never understood why it was so freaking hard to reconcile an account. You go to the general ledger, you go to the source document, you're taking time, boom.
So you understand why I'm asking these questions.
But the complexity of all the different funds and how they're all allocated, okay, is one there of complexity. You had people for years and years and years, again, designing workflows that didn't understand the workflows. So then you had somebody else come in. So you had a 2-step process that had 20 steps because people would add layers of complexity into it. And again, it's just a function of time pulling all that back. But number one, having the competency to know what you're looking at and rebuild that infrastructure. Who would ever have thought going to a general ledger that debits and credits were going to the same account? Okay, nobody.
But that's what kills me. Like, how did that ever get past like the people up
With
here?
all due respect, Commissioner McVoy was barely allowed to ask one question about a simple number, and we've spent a lot of time on this.
Excuse me, Commissioner Stokes, I'm having an important conversation with our.
I was too. So I'm going to ask one thing, and I'm going to state something for a minute, with all due respect. The previous commission that was in here for 10 years, and I sat on this commission in the past, and I heard that commission say, oh, the people before us left us a mess. And I never particularly liked that idea. Take responsibility for when you're here. Don't blame it on the people before. But I can tell you, I'm pissed as hell that we had 10 years of business people on this commission, and we have this kind of a mess that we can't, I agree with the concern that we're this far in. I'm not blaming you. I'm blaming the previous commission that they did not get their hands around it as business people. They should have had their hands and arms around this and made sure that everything was working. It's complicated, but it's not that complicated. It's adding and subtracting. Basically.
I'm all right. Okay, guys, let's get this.
So I have a high degree of unhappiness with the previous commission that they left us a mess of this sort.
Commissioner McVoy, I understand, Commissioner Lee, I understand everyone's frustration. And casting aspersions, stones, pointing fingers isn't going to get us anywhere forward, okay? The fact of the matter is I got a better historical view of what's going on here than anybody in this room. All right, and over the last 13 years, I've been through 5 finance directors and probably 50 finance staff, okay? At different periods of time. There were years in there where we were operating with an interim finance director while we looked for the next answer. Okay? I can't overstate the importance of the continuity and having continuity of staff from year to year to year in an organization that I still think majority of the people that live here don't understand how complex operating this organization with an full service utilities, full service public works, full service everything. You guys have heard me say we're a small town, 7 square miles with metropolitan size issues or operations. Okay? The audit has come to a full head, and that was brewing for years because of the lack of continuity and consistency in staff rolling over. When people leave, there goes institutional knowledge out the door, and essentially you're starting over every single time. Okay, we have finally got to a place where I'm seeing the same faces longer than one fiscal year, which gives me all the confidence in the world that we have built a team finally, whether it's Bruce, Yannick, Andre, and the line of finance staff, because it's a department of probably 20 plus people. Okay? That consistency in staff and instituting the discipline and instituting the policies that we don't waver on is what will set this straight once and for all. So that this commission, the next commission, and 5 commissions later don't have to look back and say, what were they doing 30 years ago? These aren't problems that happened in the last 10 years. We've been in a cleanup mode since the day I walked in this city. Pick a fund. It's been complete cleanup and fix and institute the proper policies. Hiring Stantec. Okay, something that was used as a tool in the water utilities for years. We all said, man, we need help. How can we explain this, all this budget information to an elected body with no training? I don't know, 6, 7 years ago, we said, oh, let's use Stantec. And it's been part of our budget process since, and it's been nothing but helpful. These policies that Bruce talked about earlier, setting these fund balance, we've talked about this every year with the pilot. Why is it this 10% one year? Why is it 6% one year? Why is it 7%? Why? Because we haven't taken the time to stop and talk about the right way of doing things, because it's what fire do you want to put out today? What funding issue, what emergency do we have to grapple with today that we don't have the resources for to deal with? Don't forget, not too long ago, we laid off 50-something employees in the city. That wasn't a generation ago. That was a few years ago. Okay, so the frustration is widely shared. I think we have a group of elected officials as a body. We have department directors with leadership, and we have a team finally in all the right seats to get this straightened out once and for all. But it's going to be painful and it's going to be frustrating, but we have to do it. Okay? We have to do this. But looking back, and this is why my mom would always say, your eyes are on the front of your head for a reason, boy. Let's just keep looking forward. All right? But yes, it's frustrating. The audit, I wish I would have had it 5 months ago. But I can almost promise you on the record, the audit next year won't be late.
And Bruce, you all right with
No,
that?
I know who's in the audience.
He just looked over at his team and they're like,
Director, Mr. Yannick, all right, who has a background in audit. That's why we brought him on the team. We had an issue every year. Audit. Okay, let's go hire a problem. Let's go hire a solution to the problem. Mr. Yannick's been A+++ employee since the day he's walked in here.
and again, this was nothing against the employees, and Commissioner
Understood.
Stokes, please let me finish my comment. This is nothing against the employees or our team. It's just coming in as an elected, wanting us to make decisions. It's like, I would like a starting point on my decision
We
making.
have this conversation every single day.
Okay, great.
And listen, guys, and I apologize for getting animated. This is truly, okay, and I think it gets used a little too loosely at times. This is the epitome, okay, of running the city and governing a city. It's the ultimate team effort.
Absolutely.
From the elected officials down to city administration, down to the department, down to Mr. Larry.
Absolutely.
We all play a role. Okay, but we just have to recognize and just accept, just like we accept all the wonderful things that we love about our town, It's not all peaches and roses, okay? It has been a struggle, flat out. It has been a struggle to get things right. But we got the right people here finally.
Onward.
Okay, onward and upward. All right. Mr. Bruce, I forget kind of where we left off.
Well, I thank you. You made a beautiful segue into our next conversation. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. It's the financial policy guidelines. I really wanted to, one, give it to you so that you have a little bit of time between now and the adoption of the budget, because this will be part of the budget adoption. It will be a separate appropriation or ordinance, I should say, resolution. We are tossing out the old policies and substituting these. If you ever read the old ones, there wasn't a whole lot of substance to them. So what we're trying to do is implement policy, strong fiscal policy that's in broad, very, very broad stroke. We're dividing the conversation into the governmental funds, which will have a targeted fund balance of 25% of revenues. And then the enterprise fund, which will have a 180-day policy. Now, if you take a look at this document, it's not going to match up to what David is going to have on Stantec. They have the old policy, so once we adopt this, David will update his model. So I just want to make sure that if you're looking at one, you'll understand that. The fund balance policies are really in the general fund. There's different components, starting with the rainy day reserve, capital reserves, budget stabilization reserves. If you would read those detail, I won't go through each one of them at the moment. And then at the end, again, the enterprise fund reserves. Then at the end, which will be a topic of conversation as we move forward, you'll note the last comment in red, the internal note for discussion, master resolution has 10% implementation. That refers to the, right now we have an 8% pilot reimbursement back to the general fund. The master resolution of the combined utility has a covenant of not to exceed 10%, 8 not to exceed 10. We can go lower than the 10. That's not a problem. If we went higher than the 10, we'd be in hot water, so to speak. For the conversation can be, just keep it at a range of 8 to 10, or just say, yeah, and then with super majorities. But that's something that we can talk about going forward, along with the 8%, if that's the desire of the commission.
And this is across the board for all enterprise funds, water,
All
sewer,
enterprise funds and
electric.
all enterprise funds and all governmental funds, including the general fund. So, for example, the beach fund, the golf fund, the goal would have a 25% reserve.
And that's a standard
That's the standard. If you're a
from
AAA,
city to city, or for what standard?
A AAA is over 30%.
To affect our bonding.
Right.
Okay.
This is what I would say a threshold, because not only are you doing this for unrestricted reserves, you're putting money into a stabilization, you're putting in capital, you're really, really, building the city and giving it a wonderful foundation. Some of this will be able to happen quickly. For example, when we did the general fund will be able to be done quickly because we were, and the beach fund probably because we did that reimbursement bond last year, that ad valorem bond that we reimburse ourselves with. So that was able to come back and really help our fund balance positions in a lot of these funds. Other funds, it's going to be more difficult. For example, the electric company, to get to 180 days, it's going to take a couple of years to get there. But with David's, modeling and that kind of thing, and, we talk about sensitivity analysis for the rates and that type of stuff, we can map out a plan along with the capital plan and everything else. So it's all lockstep. And, if things change, we can see how things change.
And that map will show us where the rating is at 8%, 9%, and 10%. I mean, maybe, is it hard to predict a bond rating at 8?
You cannot
9 and
predict
10?
a bond rating. A bond rating is a independent, they give you areas that they look at. But to say that we're going to predict a bond rating of X, you can't do it. And you'd be, I'd be telling you a lie if I said,
Well, you could do it if we were 5%. Right? That wouldn't be good.
If you were at 5%, you would be having a different conversation.
Right. Okay.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned something that the general fund, you thought we could get to the 25% relatively easily. And if I understood right, you said that was based on an ad valorem bond that we did. So we borrowed some money based on our previous ratings and other things. And that money became available, and that gives us a 25%, or gets us pretty close to a 25%.
One of the things that we did a little over a year ago now was at the beginning of the pandemic, and revenues were getting tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. One of the conversations that I had with Davenport was, what do we do if our working capital gets lower and lower and lower? We need a plan to look out 3, 4, 5 months to say, if we don't have money to pay salaries or to pay accounts payable, we need a source. So the conversation was, all right, let's do a working capital bond or borrowing, 2 to 3 year borrowing, just to put it in the bank account, if you will. And the more we talked about it, the more we figured out that the city had paid a lot of its own money for Pago Capital. So what we did was say, okay, rather than borrowing money that we have to pay back in 3 years, let's pay ourselves back that Pago money and use that to seed the working capital of the city, and to be able to be used for different purposes once we get over different capital ratios. So that's what I was referencing, that bond, that it was a late August of last year, I believe, September of last year.
I'm probably financially very dense, but I'm looking at my grocery bills, my rent bills, whatnot, and I'm saying, I don't think I have enough money to pay this. I don't have a 25% or 3 months or whatever similar idea of reserve. So I'm going to go to the bank and I'm going to borrow $5,000, and I'm going to put that in my reserve bucket. I'm going to say, now I got a reserve. But I just borrowed that money. My income didn't go up any, my expenses didn't go up any. So yes, it looks like I have a reserve, but it's money I borrowed that I'm going to have to pay back. Am I missing something? Am I being dense? It's quite possible I am being dense.
I wouldn't say you're being dense, but I would.
Which is okay. I accept that.
No, I wouldn't tell you that. Again, remember the first problem that we were facing. We were facing revenue shortages.
Right.
Okay. So to put the city on a sufficient working capital foundation, we were going to have to borrow. Okay. That was step one. But then the conversation again turned to, you pay what the city ought to have done. Okay, and a lot of these issues was to pay to borrow. It never borrowed. It did all its capital pay them.
That's how the casino got built.
That's the way the casino got built. And because they borrowed, they depleted the reserves of the city, right? So we kind of like said, okay, what would it, simple equation, what would have happened if we borrowed for those projects rather than paying cash? So we reimbursed ourselves. Yes, you're absolutely right. We have a long-term debt service, okay, but we weren't looking now at negative fund balances. Negative fund balances, not positive fund balances, negative fund balances across the funds. Okay, the general fund had like $3 or $4 million of fund balance. All right, we were scary close to inefficient working capital. We had to do something. We had to do something. So we said, okay, let's reverse. If we could have gone back in time and done it correctly, we would have borrowed for these projects. That's what we did. We turned the clock around. We borrowed it. We paid ourselves back the money. We put the city in a secure fiscal position, especially in light of COVID. We didn't know the duration. We didn't know the depth of what that was going to entail. We were fortunate to be able to work through that.
And borrowing is part of the business of, providing services.
The reality is, with utilities, especially utilities, those utilities are capital intensive. If you look at a private entity, okay, those, electric, look at a balance sheet of an electric utility. They have a lot of borrowing to it, okay, because they need to leverage those upfront revenue streams to build the infrastructure to deliver that. You look at water, you look at sewer, the same capital intensive type businesses. The golf course, to a degree, the beach fund to a degree, okay, the roads to a degree. All these things are capital intensive. It's not uncommon. What you don't want to do, all right, and we talk about this in the policy too, is that you don't want to get to a spot where all you're doing is paying off your debt. Okay.
And you're not saving.
So I think we have 12% as like a maximum amount of debt service that you can have as a percentage of your expenditures per year. Now, when you buy a house, if I remember correctly, the underwriting standard is 32%. It's probably changed since it is involved. So we're looking at 10-12% versus over 30%. Okay. So you want to keep a governor on the amount of debt payments that you make, but at the same time, you have to have fiscal flexibility, budgetary flexibility. And if you do it all pay-go and you have a tax levy capacity and you can't raise that capacity, you need to be strategic in how you build your balance sheet and the way you build your budget.
Thank you, Bruce, for bringing up the educational aspect of the budget, because, the thing I'm afraid we're leaving out is how we spend it. And I hope, in the future, we're going to talk about that. But, you're in a tough position where you have to educate mistakes of the past, and you've brought it to the fore, and I hope you're not suffering the consequences.
No, I love my job. I love the people I work with.
That's all. I just appreciate thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Quick question, Bruce. Do you know how much that was that you guys borrowed last August? You said August?
We did two. It was a 16 million, and
They put 8 million.
So you just mentioned, just real quick, we want to be under 12% for debt service is the goal.
in the general fund.
In the
for
general fund.
governmental funds, you want under 10%.
Okay.
Under
So
10%.
if we're.
But I think the policy says 12.
It does.
Okay. Yeah.
So, but if we're looking at the pension bond thing that we're looking at now, will we still be possibly under that, or does that not go
That goes over here because you're taking one liability and replacing it.
swapping it?
Right,
Okay, thank you.
that's me.
And is it correct to say that it's a little bit different to borrow money for future capital expenses than to borrow money for operating expenses?
Unequivocally. There's a simple rule. You use one-time revenues, and you'll hear me say this many, many times. You use one-time revenue sources for one-time expenditures. Otherwise, you're going to build a structural deficit.
Right.
Okay.
And that's my concern, that as that's where I'm trying with these capital things to get our hands, all of us collectively around, okay, what are one-time things that the ARPA money, the federal money of various flavors? Let's pretend that doesn't exist. We'll use it, that's fine, but don't be thinking about that to fix the roads, because roads is an ongoing issue, and that one-time pop is probably not coming back on that. We ought to be thinking about some other way to do it.
That's my second kind of like top issue. You know, a lot of communities borrow for their road infrastructure. But the problem is you borrow that money year over year over year, and you start paying that debt service year over year. And let's say you have a 20-year amortization, and you borrow every year for 20 years.
And your road runs out in 15 years, you got a problem.
Well, you're building to a 40-year. But the problem is that you're borrowing every $2 million, $3 million every year, and you're paying that back every year. So when you hit 20 years, you're paying more back because of you have that debt service, the interest. If you were just to have implemented a pay-go system. So yes, there are capital needs or capital requests that are more of a recurring type expense that you need to build in your budget. Same as the pension or maintenance.
Right.
Okay. Well, you push out long enough. Okay, that $1,000 patch on your roof now turns into a $50,000 new roof. So you've gone from a maintenance issue to a capital issue. That's the problem that, in my opinion, that the city, that's why, you have a lot of capital needs, is because it didn't have the capacity internally to do the maintenance piece. And now it went from maintenance to capital.
Yeah.
And that's my concern with the pension fund possibility borrowing in the future.
I don't know what you're.
Well, the same scenario of the roads, we could transfer to the pension fund bonding that was mentioned.
Well, the pension bond funding is you're substituting one liability with another liability. That pension is
the one is going to cost us.
They both cost it. So the exercise is what's going to cost you less. At the end of the day, you're trying to reduce the overall expense to the city. And how can we do that?
And the basic, if I understood it right, this is a deviation a little bit, but the basic deal with the pension fund is if we borrow at 4% to pay off something that was at, say, 7%, if I remember the numbers about right, we come out ahead as long as those 4 and 7 stay stable over time, which we don't know in the future.
That's the risk. You don't know what the market.
Right.
But the borrowing market right now is very favorable.
It's very favorable.
Right. Typically, the uncertainty is what the investment market is going to do.
Right.
That's the concern.
If it stays above 4, that was a really smart decision, and we're good to go. We made money on the deal.
And you feel bad for all those communities that borrowed at
12,
6 and whatever so yeah. But the actuarial, assumptions are assumptions, but if I'm looking at a $6 million net present value benefit to the city over the life of that loan, that's a considerable number. And then you pull in $30 million upfront in the first 5 years, that's an awful lot of money to say we could maybe do something. Not to go all wild, not to get overly aggressive with things, but look at opportunities.
That's the conversation we'll have in the future.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. So I think, city manager, I am through and would now like to turn it over to David.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
Thank you to the whole team.
David, real quick before you get started, let me close it a little bit more before we jump into this. I got a real strong belief that sound financial policies, once they're instituted, will stand the test of time. All right. Now, obviously, replacing staff and going through staff turnover, if you ever had a business and deal with staff, it's difficult at times. But if you have a strong, sound financial foundation, and then your finances and your funds aren't used, you just view it in a singular year kind of way, but you look outward and strategic and periods of years, it will stand the test of time. And it's taken us this long to try to get to a point where we're having these types of conversations. This is very, very complex set of policies that Bruce has introduced you guys to, that we're going to jump into, next month when it comes back to you in the form of a reso. But this is a significant amount of commitment that we're embarking on. That, to your comment earlier, Chris, could this have been done in the past? We've all known that we've needed this, but when you deal with 4 or 5 finance directors in a short period of time, everybody's got a little bit of a different approach to things. So I appreciate you guys' patience and understanding, but we'll get through all this stuff together and do the right thing to set the city up forward, so that the night crew that comes after us don't have to look behind and say, what were they doing?
Yeah, no, the idea, if I understand it, is set policy that's stronger than both staff and elected officials, that guides the course in a good direction.
There you go.
And I'm excited that we're all here to be able to be part of these policy procedures and changes. And I thank staff for bringing them forward.
Yeah.
It actually helps, our decision-making so much easier once we have policies and procedures to follow. So thank you for all the work that you guys did on putting these together.
All right. Thank you.
I concur. And Bruce, that was the way you just explained it really was very helpful and basic. It's like a family sitting around the kitchen table going, what can we afford? How can we do this? So I appreciate that.
Okay. Good evening, commissioners. Again, my name is Dave Hyder with Stantec.
Yep.
So we're going to pull up the presentation here. Some of this will look familiar from our last workshop.
Hold the button down on the side of the microphone. I don't think you're on.
Yep. Does that sound better?
Better.
There we go. All right. I knew I couldn't hear any feedback. Okay. So in terms of the discussion this evening, we go to the next slide, Rob. We're going to first talk just a little bit about the process, and then we'll talk about the governmental funds, which we didn't talk about last time, and then we'll go through the enterprise funds. And we do have the models. If we want to look at any different scenarios, we can pull those up. We probably only have, 3 to 4 hours worth of material here. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. We'll go through it relatively quickly. Feel free to ask any questions as we go. So in terms of the overall process, we go to the next slide, Ralph. Just to remind you, this is an integrated financial sustainability analysis. And so essentially what we do is we build a financial forecast for each of the separate funds. And so we do get into a lot of detail. We're looking at the actual customers that use each of those funds. So whether it's water demands, electric demands, use at the beach for parking, all those different items. We look at the operating needs in terms of the operating costs, look at capital costs. And that financial forecast provides us with a framework to look at different sensitivity analysis and scenarios. What happens if growth slows down? What happens if we fund more, we fund less? And we can compare that against specific metrics that we need to meet within the funds. A lot of discussion this evening about reserve targets and policies. We can look at the interaction between the general fund and the various funds with the franchise fees and the interfund transfers. And then ultimately what this allows us to do is have a long-term forecast, gives us a sense as we go forward what each of the funds look like. And then the city has been through this process annually where you can kind of check in and say, well, this is where we thought we'd be and this is now where we are. So with that background, just a little bit more in terms of the key factors in the analysis. So we're still seeing some lingering effects of COVID-19. It did impact all the funds, majority of the funds in fiscal year 2020. We are seeing some lingering impacts as we've gone through 2021. Some of those positive, some of those negative. We are using the unaudited fiscal year ending 2020 financials as our starting point for our projections. City has provided us with fiscal year 22 budget and a 5-year CIP for each of the funds. And then in particular for the general fund, we have the fiscal year 22 preliminary tax roll from the property appraiser, which allows us to know how much ad valorem revenue that we're anticipated to receive. So first off with the beach fund, some of the assumptions here, the projected revenues for the beach fund for fiscal year 22 are higher than we originally forecasted. Part of that is due to the increase in park mobile revenues. That's had a pretty significant increase. We've also seen an increase in beach activity during fiscal year 21, and we're anticipating that's going to continue in 22. So last year when we looked at this, we did anticipate that fiscal year 22, there'd be an increase in the metered parking rate of 50 cents. That's no longer in the forecast. So we are assuming no increase in the parking meter rates. Another assumption is that the parking transaction growth, we're anticipating that's going to be 1% per year, but we do level that off by fiscal year 26. We're assuming that doesn't continue to grow because at some point you run out of parking spaces. So you have some constraints there. And then finally, this sounds like a scenario we're going to want to run, is we did assume that the beach property improvements of $6 million could potentially be bond funded within the beach fund. But that would require some increases in the parking metered rate in future years.
Any consideration for rent income from the second floor?
Yes, so we do factor in the common area leases, things of that sort, but I don't recall. I don't think we did not.
Totally unperforming on the second floor.
Correct.
And we don't consider that any potential income at all somewhere from anywhere, anybody?
Well, we can't rely on it right now.
Commissioner Roberts, historically, we used to pin in future revenues at $15 a square, but we stopped. But again, that would be new capture revenue if we do find a lease situation where we're generating revenue, but we stopped accounting for it because we're not collecting.
Because we're not marketing it.
I'm going to jump in here for a second. And Mr. Robinson, I completely agree with you. This is one of the things that I am, we all have our levels of frustration. That empty room is one of my levels of frustration. And I'm hoping that we can at some point get a little creative, find out, really get to the bottom of why I don't even think there's a CO at this point, and see if we can't use this for something. And we're all frustrated by it. I am specifically frustrated by that. And I'm hoping that in the year to come, we can figure out a way to get some revenue from that. I have some ideas and I'm sure we can brainstorm a little bit about that. But I agree with you. And I don't.
And if I may remind everyone, Stantec's models are based off assumptions. Okay, so I think if you stay focused on the key parts is FY22, for instance, there's no parking rate being proposed, increase being proposed. Now in the model, when David turns the page, it'll show parking rate starts to kind of ramp up in 2026, 2025. There you go. It doesn't mean that in 2023, 2024, 2025, if we end up making an aquatic improvement and we find leases for the second floor, then obviously, these conversations will happen annually. So don't get locked in to saying, well, in 2026 through 2031, we're going to have a 25-cent increase. This may in all reality come 2022, 23 or 2023, and looking outward could get smoothed over in a different pattern where maybe it's 10 cents a year, 20 cents a year, depending on what improvements happen up there, because as we move forward towards some sort of aquatic improvement, obviously the necessity and the pressure to generate additional revenues will be part of that whole conversation as we identify our pro forma. So I don't want you guys just to get locked in based on assumptions shown in the model. Because easily Ralph could go in and change the models right now and spit out a different version.
No, I think we have to deal with what we actually have. I think it's just important for us not to forget that that's a potential source of funds as well.
Yes, Madam Mayor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. So this is what we call the panel for the beach fund. And what it shows is the fiscal year 21 through the projection period, fiscal year 31. And the key revenue source for the beach fund is the parking rate. And so that's the variable that we have here. And as the city manager alluded to, we are assuming no increase in the parking metered rate until fiscal year 26. And then we just plugged in there a 25-cent increase in each of those subsequent years. So you'd go from $3 up to about $4.50 by fiscal year 31 if everything played according to this plan. It's important to note, though, that this does assume that $6 million beach property improvements, and we would issue some debt associated with that. And so that's factored in. If we did not have that within the beach fund, we'd still need some increases, but we could push those out probably till fiscal year 28, 29. So there is that flexibility there in terms of the funding. The working capital fund, you can see you're well above that current target of 2 months. Again, as we go through each of these this evening, you'll see different targets, but as Bruce mentioned, policies move towards the common target. But again, you're well above that target, moving down towards the target over time because of the cash flow deficits associated with revenues, not meeting expenditures. Any questions on the beach fund?
So at some point, as I mentioned at the previous time you were here, the cool part about this is that you can look at exactly what Juan referred to, the assumptions. They're just assumptions, and they're a starting point, reasonable ones, but you can say, well, what happens if we do something different?
Right.
I don't know at what point in the presentation we might want to look at that, but one obvious one to look at is, well, what if the investment in pool things is not 6 million, but it's something more modest, like 2 million? What does that look like? And you mentioned just off the top, you probably looked at a little bit, that might push the parking increase out for 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Yep.
In numbers, but then the question is, what does a pool look like?
Sure, and another piece of it is, well, if the pool is fancier, if it's a $6 million pool, does that bring more people in? Are you maxed out? That doesn't matter because your parking is already maxed out. There's all sorts of variables there. If you do a 2 million one and you have all sorts of cool activities that bring in revenue, well, that's another piece that's independent of parking. There's a lot of, not everything is in the model. The model is not the territory.
Right. Yeah.
It's close, but
yeah. We do have most of it in there. And
we do have a lot.
We can certainly pull it up at any point in time. I'll go through the general fund, just some assumptions here. So the big driver for revenues in the general fund is property, the millage rate. And so key driver in that is property value growth. And so you've seen robust property value growth. Over the past 4 years, it's averaged a little over 10% per year. The property appraiser for fiscal year 22 growth is 9.3%. And then what we've assumed, again, another assumption in the model is that you're going to see property value growth continue at 7% a year from this point forward. Difficult to predict given the housing market and whatnot, but at this point, given the history, that's what we have factored in for an assumption on property value growth.
And the problem is we have no control over how the appraiser behaves towards our property in Lakewood Beach.
And we also have no control over what the market does to property values. We see them going up, and that's causing us all sorts of affordability.
Probably a little more control over that than the appraiser.
Not sure how, but
Yeah, I would say I'm with the mayor, not sure how.
Selling what we have, by, celebrating what we have.
right, which when you look at, you know, I mean, from a fiscal point of view, it's good for us to have the higher property because we get more taxes from it. But on the other hand, you know, when you look, if you're looking to buy a house at this point, it's pretty crazy prices. So, moving on.
Moving on. Another assumption in the model is the franchise fees. They reflect about 8.7% of the total revenues to the general fund. And that reflects an 8% of gross revenues from each of the enterprise funds transferred over to the general fund. And then when we play this out, we are showing that projected expenses do outpace revenues starting in fiscal year 23. This is based on assumed cost inflation, revenue adjustments, and no revenue adjustments outside of the growth that we just talked about. So at some point, if things played out as we're going to show in the forecast, we would need to do something either to enhance revenues or to reduce costs. So as we look at the panel, the driver here you can see is the millage rate and the fire MSTU. So that gives you your total millage, as Bruce alluded to, of about 9, so 8.9 right now. Our forecast again is assuming no adjustment in the millage rate. You can see below that we also do have the ability to change the taxable value increase. We've got the 7% in there going forward. You can see that from a cash flow standpoint, we're forecasting that a break even in fiscal year 22, but then we would have cash flow deficits in future years. And essentially that's just driven by the fact that we are assuming cost inflation in the general fund, and revenues, while they are increasing, they're not increasing at the same pace as cost inflation. So you do have some deficits.
And your inflation, you're assuming about 3%, or what's the assumption?
We do look at every single budgetary line item. So some are much higher. If it's, you know, benefits and things like that, they're higher. But on average, yeah, it's about 3%.
Yeah. And for us, if you could go back one, for us, the thing that as elected officials, I would think we want to keep our eye on is those blue columns relative to the black line, that the trend in the blue columns is clearly in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. We're running ourselves into the hole there. And the other part that we, you know, the total millage, we're at 9, there's a cap at 10. Mm-hmm. In addition to, you know, there's a lot of good reasons you don't want to go from 9 to 10, but even if you did want to go, you're banged out at 10.
Right. I would say we do a lot of these analysis in Florida in particular, and this is a very common picture. Mm-hmm. There's very few cities, municipalities that have a forecast of continued fund balance above a line, just because generally you end up not spending your full budget. Things like that happen in terms of costs don't always necessarily come in as expected. So this isn't an uncommon picture, but you're absolutely right. If it played out like we have forecasted here, there would need to be some, there's not a lot you can do in terms of revenue enhancements.
Yeah. And if I may, two key points to think about that. Thank you for stating that, David. Is one, these assumptions are based on a proposed budget, which we've all learned here over time that, you know, payroll doesn't always go all fully spent, and there's money that drops to attrition or unused in fund balance. So that your true ups at the end of the year are extremely important, but also the fact that as we look at investing money or what to spend money on, I mean, if you remember the uncontrollable and the controllable pie, the controllable that we can actually have money that's disposable to do things is very small. So when we spend money on, especially in the general fund, whether, you know, feel good stuff, you know, events, when we look at pay adjustments, when we look at, buying things and whatnot, every dollar matters, and how we spend money, where we put money at matters. Because the graph speaks for itself. And even though for the most part, every municipality's graph looks very similar, doesn't mean that, we don't, I don't want to say, loosey-goosey with how we do it, because we're not, right? Probably a bad term to use here. But we just got to maintain discipline in how we spend and invest the money, especially in the general fund, where there is no capacity for rate. No one up here wants to talk about increasing millage. It's already pretty dangerous being at that 9% with a 10% cap. And, so this paints your story of why as we continue to look at out to the out futures of growing, and you've heard us say this before, growing our tax base and trying to add to the population, and trying to get that over the hump of becoming an entitled municipality. And all the here we do things such incremental, and small chunk sized pieces because of our financial struggles that we've had over the years in the general fund. So
A question for you is, Sandy. This is something that's, and I think you've all followed Lake Forest for a while, and we obviously are a community that has challenges, maybe not that different than a lot of others, but somewhat different in that we do have financial challenges as a community. And it's frequently stated that, well, the trick to that is to build more buildings and get more people to come into the city, and that will solve this problem. It seems to me that one of the things that's extremely useful of these models is I would think that you could do that analysis pretty easily. If we add 5,000 units and you make some estimates of, whether they're rental or whether they're bought and all that stuff, which you could pretty easily do, make reasonable assumptions in a couple different scenarios. We could actually look at that and answer that question. Does it significantly change that? And how many do you have to increase by doubling the population? Or is getting another 1,000 people in here enough? And that's something that I would definitely be very interested to help us make fact-based decisions. And then, of course, you could do an additional scenario just to make your lives a little more complicated. But what if we give these new developments a 10-year tax abatement? How does that look when we do that?
Yep.
So I would be very interested in us putting some energy into using these tools to do a little bit of exploration of that so that we have a better basis to decide.
Yeah, you certainly could. I did run it just if you, instead of 7%, if you assumed a 10% increase in the taxable value, it basically pushes it out to 2028, where you just barely meet the line. So if you assumed,
it doesn't change it all that much, actually.
Yeah, because you have to.
For the assumption.
You have to remember that I think the millage and the total millage brings in about 30% of the revenues in the general fund. Right. And so it's not. It's not that big a lever. Right. You got
let's bear in mind though, and I've learned that the tax doesn't really go up that much, but we also have to consider that with the apartments and the condo, the development that we have now coming, there's a lot of more electricity going to be sold. There's going to be a lot more water and sewer revenues. So even though the ad valorem tax may not be really a kick for 10 years until the TIF is gone, but we also do have other sources of revenue for those people. And I think we also have to keep in mind that we don't have large tracts of land to develop. We're pretty limited in our space. So
we can only go up. That's pretty much all that's left. We're pretty much built out with a few, there's some block exception. But again, we say these things that, well, the people will bring in taxes, but they'll also bring in the others. Usually the goal, particularly since we own their municipal owned utilities, the goal is not really to make money on them. The goal is to provide a service at fairly close to at cost. So again, I would like us to use those tools. And so when we say that the estimated increase, well, it'll be this much from property tax, this much from water, sewer, we have those numbers. We can do that analysis relatively easily. And we should, so that we, instead of saying that this is going to happen, we say, and here are the numbers.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would say in terms of utilities, you're not looking to make money, but you are essentially spreading fixed costs over customers. So generally your water system, it doesn't cost you much.
Water, that's true. Electric, it's a lot less true.
Sure, exactly. Yeah.
Except that it contributes to the general fund. And if we're competitive in the market of electricity,
I agree. Okay, moving on.
All right. So next is enterprise funds. And now this will be somewhat more review, but we have updated each of the enterprise fund models just based on the final budgets, as well as some additional information. We got the final purchase power forecasts. And so now that's included in here, and included in that is the Port St. Lucie refinance. And so that did help the picture. So we're assuming the exact same increases we had before. We've shown it here though, in terms of the increase to the customer. So this is what your typical customer sees in terms of the monthly increase in their utility bill, 1.73%. So their bill goes from 107. Sorry, I can't see it that far.
107.99.
107.99 to 109.85 in 23. But you'll notice if we look at the working capital fund that we are now closer to that 6-month target, which is the black line, above the 3 months during the forecast period.
This is Ed Liberty. I'd like to jump in for a moment and just point out a couple of things here, because this is a very helpful slide. I just want to reemphasize this. The 107.99 is not the actual bill. That's the pre-tax portion of the bill. So the 107.99 gets grossed up to about 117 or so on a 1,000 kilowatt hour customer with taxes, and that would include the utility tax, which I believe goes to the city, and then the general fund contribution is 8% within the 107.99. So there's a general fund contribution that happens there as well. I think as you'll see here, that this $2 increase is barely enough to keep up with the additional contributions to the general fund and shared services. So it's not really getting us to our ultimate goal, which I think is where the Stantec is taking us to. So we're gonna have to talk a lot more about that. But historically, when you look at our working capital, same situation Bruce has described, we found in the electric utility over 3 years ago, when we discovered that we were in a negative fund balance position. And to Commissioner Malega's comments, we didn't know that for many, many months after it had happened, probably 9 months or more. And that has a lot to do with what had taken place in the past, and we discovered that things were being expensed rather than capitalized. So the analogy would be if you're building a house, or you're making an addition to your house, you paid for it all out of cash in that particular year, instead of using a home equity loan and financing it over the life of the addition. So we were paying for everything in cash, out of fund balance all at one time. We were not capitalizing. That's what took place in the past. So that depleted the fund balances and effectively wiped out working capital. So if you look at these historically, you'll see that the working capital was very, very bad or very low and has been recovering. But we're still well short of that target line, which would be the 180 days. So Commissioner Malega, we talked about there being about a 10 million gap in working capital. You can see that in the 21 column between the red line and the target line. And that's the gap that we need to close. So this is kind of a bare bones base case minimum rate increases that we would be looking at. And we all knew there would be rate increases at some point. But what I promised you is that we wouldn't ask for them until we believe that we are at the point where cost cutting was no longer going to get us to where we needed to be. So we're having that kitchen table conversation now. What we need to do. This is the first few.
But at the same time, Mr. Liberty, we've also talked about with the rate increase will be a fuel adjustment cost, correct? To offset?
Right. What's probably going to wind up happening now is the base rates will go up to accommodate these additional costs. And the fuel charge will go down from where it is today. It probably won't go down to where we thought we could get it to just 2 months ago. But if you look at what natural gas prices have done in the past 30 to 60 days, I think we've seen probably a 5+% increase just in the last 10 days or so. So the futures prices are racing upward. That could be hurricane related for the next 3 months, but nonetheless they're up. But we do believe that the fuel charge will come down from where it has been historically, but the base energy rate will go up. And these charges that you see here would go into the base energy rate.
I have a question about, do we typically do rate increases in like whole number increments, or is this normal, like 1.73, 1.75?
Yeah.
Or like 0.25% or something, I'm just wondering how you arrived at these
exact numbers.
So it's
Yeah, this is what the math yields. The ultimate rate increase would be, determined by the commissioner, and you can do it round numbers, but this is just what the formula yields as a percentage with a decimal.
it's essentially a 3% increase in the base and volume charge.
Okay.
So it doesn't include an increase in the fuel charge. And so when you look at the bill, that's the increase in the bill is less than 3%. But we have assumed a 3% increase across the board. But I believe the last meeting, one of the commissioners asked us to show it in terms of the impact to the actual.
Okay,
customer.
so this is the same,
This is-
3% we saw last time, it's just, okay,
Correct.
thank you.
I think the way to look at this is a kind of a blunt instrument of saying, what have you applied X amount of increase across all of the revenues coming in from the various rate classes. When we switch over to the rate discussion, that's where Leidos comes in. We look at the revenue requirement, and then with your guidance, we determine how much of that will be applied to a residential customer versus a commercial customer versus a commercial demand customer. How much of that can be raised through raising certain fixed fees, which would only affect a limited number of customers. So we have to get into the next step after this is the distribution of how is that revenue going to be raised? Is it going to be, as this model indicates, a flat across everybody? Or are we going to do some engineering, if you will, within the cost structure to distribute that increase?
And that includes the minimum, that minimum rate that we've been talking about?
Yes, it would, Mayor. Yes, it would. So we have to get into that discussion. But tonight's discussion, which is, and these models from Stantec are very, very helpful in framing the discussion, but it's really what I call a blunt instrument to say, hey, this is where we need to get to. And probably the most important chart here is that working capital. And you'll see successive panels, which will show what happens to our working capital for various increases in rates, because the strong desire and recommendation is to get us closer to that target line, not immediately. That would not be probably reasonable, but we do have to have, I'd say, within the next 3-4 years to be at that target at the most. But I'm really jumping into the Stantec presentation.
That's fine. I think, Rob, why don't we jump to the other presentation? If you could just switch over. So we just ran.
Before you go to that one, can you, on the expenses, the abbreviations are a little bit short. Can you walk us through PS, OMV, et cetera?
Yep. So PS is personnel services, so personnel related.
So wages and benefits.
OMV is operating costs that are variable. So that would
Operating fixed.
and then operating fixed. And then you have debt service, and then you have transfers out. And then is it PAYGO, which would be cash funded capital.
And can you point us to, I don't know if you have a pointer with you, but I'm having trouble seeing which one of the abbreviations goes with which. Now I know what they mean.
Mhm.
Purple is
Personnel service,
That's
that's the
bottom up.
first.
that's wages and benefits.
Yep, and then operating variable is the next.
Which is
second.
basically fuel.
Yep.
And then blue is fixed operating costs.
Yep.
Some of which might be, and this would be a question for Ed. I don't know that the solar contracts have come in, but one of the cool pieces about solar is that the cost doesn't change. So it's fixed over time until the panels heave over, which is 25 years out or something.
Well, that's,
Is
Yeah, that's-
any of that blue, will any of that blue, or is any of that blue in the model solar?
no, all of the solar is in the energy component, and I'm colorblind myself, so I'm assuming, is that an orange or red?
Yeah, it's
Orange.
orange.
All of
The
the solar.
second band up from the bottom.
Yeah, I would believe that all of the energy supply is in there, correct, Stantec?
Right.
Right, so, and what will happen with solar, with the first component is obviously running today, which is our own solar farm, but
Yeah,
that's
small.
that's very small and very expensive. The new solar will come online mid to late calendar 23 on their construction schedule. And obviously, I've mentioned before that I can't disclose what those numbers would be because they're confidential to the sellers. But I can tell you that it's based on today's fuel costs, it's extremely competitive with a natural gas-based power source. That's how attractive a price it is. So that, and there are two large contracts there. One is a fixed price contract for 20 years. And the other is a 2% escalating. So it escalates at 2%. So that was done by lowering the front years to make it very, very attractive, and then allowing a 2% escalation, so such that the total dollars over the 20 years was effectively the same as if we had kept it level, but very close to that. So very attractive contract. So that it would escalate just slightly. And the panels do decrease in production by about 0.3% per year. And that's taken into account in the models as well. And then what we've also done is we've used the futures markets. We don't buy gas in the futures markets. We don't buy futures contracts, but we use the futures contracts as a proxy for what fuel would cost in those later years. And that's in that band as well. And it also takes into account the refinancing of the St. Lucie project, which yields us a couple of $1 million plus benefit starting in fiscal 23. So that's baked into there as well.
Then above that, the black is the debt service, annual debt service. And then the final blue, that's a little ribbon on the top, is the transfers out. So that'd be administrative transfers to general fund.
There's actually two bands there. I just noticed there's a greenish band underneath the blue, I think.
I don't see green.
It's.
I was wondering, do we have any pay-go? Because I could barely see any
There's
green.
a tiny bit of pay-go in there.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's,
Most everything's bond funded.
Yes, commissioners, the PAYGO is worth discussing because we're leveraging that more than we ever had before. And what PAYGO effectively means is that when we have staff, let's say namely our line department, that's doing work that classifies as capital, meaning that the projects that they're working on in that particular day, week, or month are rightfully able to be considered capital. That's considered PAYGO. We capitalize that expense, their labor on that project, which means it does not hit O&M, it hits capital. That reflects that we're doing that. We're able to do that probably 1 to 2 crews per day, some days more, working 6 days a week. We're able to spend on capital projects, and that all has to be effectively audited by finance to make sure that it is truly capital work, that we're not playing a shell game and reclassifying things into an improper category. But that's our estimate for.
If we're talking policy, when are we going to talk about the commercial rate? Or even having more than one commercial rate? Or, can we have a large commercial customer and a small commercial customer, different rates?
Yes, we do, Commissioner. We have what's called a commercial general service or commercial non-demand, which is plain vanilla commercial. That's more like a bigger than a home, but not a huge business. That's up to about 18 kW of demand. Above 18 kW, and we will likely propose to raise that to 25 kW as a threshold. We get into what's called commercial demand. So that's a second commercial rate. Then we also have Palm Beach State College that is on a special contract that was negotiated back in about 1990. That is still in effect. That's a special contract. That's if you will, a third class. They're the only one on that special contract.
That expired?
It rolls over 2 years indefinitely, evergreen. So unless you catch it at the rollover time, it just rolls over. But however, you can adjust the rates as you go. It's benchmarked to the other utility in the area, and it could follow those costs. So we have turned that contract over to our rates consultants to evaluate it to see what it should be, just to make sure that that the billing system is working correctly. So that analysis is underway now.
What's the estimated arrival of that? Rate analysis?
On Palm Beach State College?
No, on the rates analysis study.
Well, what we're going to need to do is reach a decision on ultimately how much additional revenue we need to raise through rate increases. You basically use this blunt instrument to determine whether we're going to go up, 2%, 3%, 4%, whatever that number is going to be to get us to the target line. Then we would go back and relook at the cost model and make recommendations on how to apply that to specific customer classes. First, we need to determine the ultimate revenue that we need to get to.
Yeah, to be determined.
Right. And that'll be an outcome of these budget workshops and ultimately the budget you approve. But we did meet with them for a couple of hours today, and they're prepared to start running models this week. I told them I would call them after tonight's meeting, and tomorrow probably, to talk about, okay, start doing the final design that we can bring to you in September.
Okay, so there was another just discussion in terms of what you can see here on the panel is that you are continuing to need to invest in the electric system. We're assuming $89 million worth of additional borrowings in the coming years. And so one of the scenarios that we wanted to run was what happens if we potentially raise the electric rate a little bit sooner, just to potentially send the positive message to rating agencies as you look to borrow and things of that sort. And so this is the panel we just looked at. If I go to the next one, we looked at what would it be like if we had a 3% increase in the base and the volumetric charge, but let's do it at the beginning of the year. So at the beginning of the calendar year, what if we didn't put that in place till 1/1/22 and then didn't have an increase until fiscal year 24. So you take a reprieve. And what that does is at the end of the day, our cash balance is pretty similar. Maybe we get a little bit closer to the target because we had that increase sooner, but because we're taking a year off in between, we're coming back down. We're never meeting that 6-month target. So then we ran another scenario to say, well, what if we back off even more? What would it look like if we just did a 1% increase in the near term? And obviously the results are not any better. We're now taking 1% increase beginning of the calendar year, taking a year off till 24, and obviously we're going to fall below our cash targets.
What if we did 1.5 and then 1.5 2 years consecutively?
We can run that. We do have the next one, scenario C, was, well, what if we do 3 and 3? So what if we wait till January 1, do a 3% increase, then we keep the scheduled increase of 3% in 2023. That would essentially get us to the target by about fiscal year 26, almost be there in fiscal year 25.
I think
Can I
would point out excuse me, Commissioner, but I would point out that so this rate adjustment plan, presumes a train of rate increases, right? But what we would do is, check, plan, act as we go through each fiscal year to see, hey, are we on track? Are we lagging? Are we ahead of schedule? And then we would make the next recommendation, as we go. So it's important to really look at these things closely, probably quarterly. The world that I come from, you look at these things no less than quarterly, but we should look at these things frequently, see how we're doing. So we're constantly looking at actual versus budget, and looking at the forecast so that there's no surprises. But it's important to get up to that target line. That's the type of thing that the rating agencies will be looking for.
And I respect that. I really do. And I understand. My concern is, we're coming out of a pandemic. People are facing evictions and I mean, we have bigger fish to fry in the city when it comes to keeping our people in their homes. And I just personally would feel that, again, because we are adjusting the fuel cost. So I understand that there is a benefit there. But to me, I just, again, I think that we need to be cognizant of the fact that we have people in this city that aren't back to work, that are still facing the effects of a pandemic financially. And I don't know how the rest of my peers feel. And I want to express that I would feel more comfortable, I think, looking at a smaller increase, because we went from no rate increase to now we have to increase because of A, B, and C, which I completely agree with and I support. I just don't know how much of a rate increase we need to look at right now. I'm just throwing this out there. That's all.
I think that's valid feedback. the concern would be, and what the rating agencies will look at is, we know that we have increased costs, right? We're increasing the transfer to the general fund. We're increasing the share of shared services that we're absorbing. We have other increased costs. So if all we did was increase rates to match the new costs, we really haven't solved the problem of getting closer to the target line. And the rating agencies are ultimately concerned with getting that working capital number up, getting our coverage ratios up, and showing that we can manage to do that. So if all we do is increase enough to cover our expenses, we're really the same place where we are today.
Did I hear you, Ed, say correctly that an increase in the transfer to the general fund was one of the pieces of the increasing costs?
Yes, it is. That and a number of other things: general fund transfer, shared services, increased compliance costs. That's it.
But I'm a little hesitant about that because I believe part of these financial policy guidelines says, hey, we're going to stick to a max of 8% on our transfer over. So
that's very true. What we're saying, there's been an increase for fiscal 22 over where we were in fiscal 21. So the percentage increase.
Where are we now?
The percentages are constant, the dollar value increase because of budget limit. Revenue. 8% is based on revenue.
So the percentage stays the same.
Yeah,
dollar figure
that sounds like
offsets.
a wash to me if the percent's holding constant. I mean, if his revenues are coming in higher, then yeah, he's going to transfer a little bit more over.
It costs more money.
Right. The amount of dollars that we're transferring between the general fund transfer and the shared services is over $700,000 a year, $725,000 a year or so. And then we have additional compliance costs. So those were expenses that were not there before that have to be absorbed. So even though the revenue has gone up, and for example, in some cases, the revenue has gone up by a certain amount, but the profit we make on the deal is less than what the revenue went up by. So we're actually giving back more than we made. But the point is that if all we do is increase the rates to match the rate of increase of our expenses, we really haven't closed the gap in getting to that target line. And that's what's important. And we have to remember that out of every dollar of additional revenue that we have, right, additional billings that go out, we still have the utility tax that we pay, which is probably 8%. And then we also have an 8% gross receipts, or rather general fund transfer. So not every dollar of increase that we put on the bill actually gets to working capital in the utility. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. The city obviously needs these transfers, but it's just understanding the leverage of the dollars. My point is that we're going to have increases that are sufficient enough to get us to that working capital number. Unfortunately, as Bruce has pointed out, there's no specific number that we can say, hey, if you do this, the rating agencies will give you this grade, right? We don't know their grading metric, right? It's more about having them have a level of confidence that we are charging enough in our rates to warrant maintaining the rating that we have or improving the rating that we have.
I'd like to make a data request, and that would either be to Juan to pass on to Ed, or perhaps to Stantec, whoever can comply with it. And the data request is the following: that we look back, say, a 10-year, maybe even 15-year history of what have our rates done over that period, and what have FP&L rates done. And the reason that I'd like to see that history is, as we look at this 3% a year increase, that's a pretty rapid, when you add that up, when you accumulate that, that's going up quite a bit. And I'd like to have some idea of what that slope looks like compared to what the past history, both ours and FP&L's. I have a feeling that ours has looked pretty flat for quite a while, that we have not raised it at all. So now we're getting, the whack on that. But I'd like to see the two curves, that data, so that we can think about this. Because I'm with Commissioner Malega that this is a pretty rough time to be raising the rate. And especially if we're raising the rate without raising benefits. If we were pairing that with giving people a robust conservation program so that we have an effort to reduce their costs because we're helping them insulate, we're helping them put more efficient things in. If we were pairing it with that, or if we were pairing it with some, one option is community solar, where people have a guarantee of steady rate on their increases, or not rate increases, but a steady price for the next year. If we were giving some value added things, then I'd say, all right, maybe we can, the overall package is a rate increase, helps the utility, but we're giving the customer some other things. So I think it needs to be a package if we're going to go forward.
To that point, I
Hey,
can.
really quick before we go down the get down. Because we have another utility meeting tomorrow night, and I'm sure we'll.
Yeah, but
But
there's.
what I wanted to do really quick was, I don't want anyone to miss the correlation when we talk about the electric utility and rate increases, and also the pilot and how that impacts and how it's connected to the general fund. And we were looking at the general fund chart earlier, and we got to a place of having insufficient fund balance rapidly, cash on hand. Ralph, can you run a scenario where there is a 1% utility rate increase and a 7% transfer on the pilot? And to rerun those numbers?
And
Because this is back to, when you start looking at the two, right, there's been a lot of attention on the pilot at 8%, which is a number that we felt was a steady, reasonable, Bruce, what do you say, benchmark to get to an 8%. What we haven't looked at yet, though, modeling is, well, what is 7% and 1% or 7.5%, or maybe it's a ramp up to 8% on the pilot. And I bring it up because time and time again, every single budget cycle that you're going to go through while your time in office is, you're going to be grappling with a general fund that has needs that exceed our ability to cover. Okay, so again, we have to be very cautious. Uncontrollable, controllable is what I want to get back to. All right, and understanding as elected officials that setting expectations on the demand of the organization to produce certain levels, okay, and how that match up with our ability to accomplish those things. All right, we've been caught seeing leisure services, they accomplish so much, but then when you look and see how many people are on part of that staff, there's not a lot, or public works. All right, so it's trying to balance between general fund expectations, our tax base, and then how our enterprise pilots transfer in and how those are impacted. Because I think it was last year and years prior to that where we were looking to bring the general fund off of the electric utility transfer and step it down by what, Bruce, what was it, $300,000 a year incrementally?
300,000.
Now we're looking to kind of level it out right at an 8% target. So the good thing about the modeling is being able to, somewhere lies the answer. I don't want anyone to get locked into or any signals to go out that, oh, there goes the city commission looking to raise electric rates. And I will say that with a caveat. We've known for several years as we look at Stantec models that eventually a utility rate increase was going to happen. Now we're challenged with trying to figure out, well, how do we land this conversation during a pandemic, still dealing with a pandemic when we know that a substantial amount of our community is still struggling to get to week to week to week. But at the same time, have enough cash to keep things going and have enough resources to meet the expectations of the community. So it is a challenging, conversation in front of us. And we'll give Ralph a couple minutes, see if they can run just a couple scenarios so you can kind of see how they interplay. So we don't get locked into just one line.
So while
Let me step in here. Is this with with David doing that is now a good time? It's been 2 hours. Do you want to take a quick break? Anybody? Just checking.
You ready?
No, we'll run it. We can take a quick break.
Yeah, David said, Stantec guy said, yes, we can take a quick 5-minute break and they'll get the model, kind of just a scenario so we can kind of see. Cool.
All right, so it is 7:03. Let's take a 10-minute break. Commission, do you want that?
They're muted.
They're muted. Oh. Could we unmute them?
Yes.
Okay, I'm suggesting we've been at this for 2 hours and maybe everybody wants to.
Madam Mayor, we'll reconvene 10 after 7.
Okay, see you then.
Thank you.
let's see. This desk makes me so happy. We're doing. I think we're over our 7:10.
Yeah, it's 7:14, but I can't see
I can't either.
who's on the dais.
We've got to fix this visual thing soon.
Commissioner McVoy's there, Commissioner Stokes.
Robinson, I
I
see.
think
Yep.
they're all there. I think everybody's there.
Okay, great.
Keith, are we back?
Okay, we're back. We're missing Juan and Bruce though. Don't we need them? Kind of important.
Yeah, I can't see who's there and who's not there.
We
I
need Juan.
apologize.
We need Juan and Bruce. We're waiting for them.
Okay,
She wants to go.
Okay.
Well, does Stantec have the next panel? I think.
Can you hear us, Melissa? And then I have one question, sir. Can we
Yes, I
get
can.
hard copies of this?
Yes.
That would be wonderful.
I have a more exciting question. Can we get the model and play with it?
Yeah, good luck with that.
Just a question.
Yeah, that's a little more challenging. We have one more slide.
I would never know how to, so you go right on ahead. If they give you access,
On electric and then,
Yeah, we had this last slide on electric, which was just one more scenario to say, well, what if we did a 1% increase at the beginning of the calendar year, then went ahead with the 3% that we were talking about before. And this scenario gets us pretty darn close to that 6 months in the middle period.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Sure.
are you just chatting? Because is everybody back on the dais? I cannot see.
yes, we're all back. Yes,
I
ma'am.
guess we didn't formally restart.
Okay, so it is, Madam Mayor, it is
Hi.
7:17 and we are back live.
Welcome back, everybody,
Sorry about that.
to another exciting moment.
I did.
So this was the final scenario. What if we did a 1% increase at the beginning of the calendar year and then kept with the plan of increases, again, realizing that's just a forward-looking forecast. That would get us on a trajectory where we get closer to that 6-month target that we're trying to meet. And part of it is just the idea of when you have a rating agency look at you and say, well, you haven't raised rates at all, just to have some minor rate increase there would be some beneficial, some benefit from that, and that you've issued a fair amount of debt associated with the electric utility, and to have some modest increase, even if it was 1% in the halfway through the fiscal year or so, there would be some benefit in that, just showing that you're taking some action.
What does this number right here in this little box mean?
That's the cumulative increase between a period of time in a bill, in the actual bill. So you're looking at by 2026 with the increase from 2022 to 2026, that's about a 13% increase in the actual bill. And then if you went all the way to the end of the period, you're looking at about a 31% increase. But it's important to remember that that's the increase in the base charge. That's not what they actually see on the bill, which would be the cumulative impact of the percent of the bill impacts. Yeah.
So that's not a 3% increase every year.
Correct. It's a 3% in the base charge, but their bill only goes up to 1.7%. And we could add a cumulative increase to the customer bills on these.
You have the dollar numbers. Because we know that a neighboring utility is going up $13.64 over the next 4 years.
Correct. Yeah, so dollars, it would go from the 107 to 127 under this forecast in terms of the bill.
And the other one is going up how much, Ed?
$13.64 is the settlement that they've reached with their major interveners and submitted for approval by the Public Service Commission.
Over
Okay,
the
and
next
this,
4 years?
Yes,
Okay.
22, 23, 24, 25.
okay. So we're still well in line with our competitor. Correct?
That would
Yeah,
appear.
we do. Ralph, if you go back to the other presentation, might be a good segue. If you go to the next slide, we have the updated comparisons. So again, this is the one that's confusing, hard to read, but this is for the July survey, July 2021. You can see where Lake Worth Beach is compared to other utilities and what the average is. And I think the next slide is probably a little bit better. It's for a higher usage, so 1,200 kilowatt hours, but it's put in sequential order so you can see in terms of where the comparisons are Lake Worth Beach and the other utilities.
So this is at the look at this data with a very, very close eye. This comes off a series of tables. Again, this is the 1,200 kilowatt hour customer, not the 1,000 kilowatt hour customer, but the issue remains the same. If you look at that same table today with a 1,000 kilowatt hour customer, it would lead you to believe that we're more expensive than the other utility, when in fact we're 0.5% lower on the total bill. So once the taxes are added on, and these tables don't reflect utility taxes, franchise taxes, gross receipts taxes, things like that in their entirety. But when you add up all the taxes and put those two bills side by side, a 1,000 kilowatt hour customer, today we are 0.5% lower. You write a check to Lake Worth Beach would be 0.5% lower than the check you would write to the other company for a 1,000 kilowatt hour customer.
And I'll feel a little bit like I'm beating a horse or a dead horse, but as we all know, the difference between perception and reality in this town, nobody believes that we are 0.5% or even vaguely 1% lower than FPL. And that's why I think if we were to even consider any rate increases, we've got to accompany it with some other steps, like a conservation rebate program, like
or just good public information.
well, it's and yes, I do agree with that, but it's simply telling people that our rates are the same is not gonna, it's never cut it. We've been very similar for a long time, but if you ask people, they'll say, oh my gosh, you guys are 20, 30, 40, 50% higher. And that's where we've got to do the study of what does our distribution of customers, residential customers, actually look like, and why are some of them having such high bills? It's not the rate, but nobody believes that it's not the rate. And we have to do a concrete step to attack that perception.
I agree. I'm very interested in doing a conservation program where we can go after some of the least efficient homes that are seeing the unreasonably high bills that are coming in. There's no rate change that we're going to do to help those people that are actually, an average size home spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars on their utilities. I think we need to go after them.
Haven't we done that? Has there not been some sort of audit that we had years ago? I remember that the city would come out, look at your windows, look at your, and do that sort of thing. Is that something that is fallen by the wayside?
It needs to be a combination of a really solid energy audit program combined with some sort of rebate so that you can actually help people get into more efficient AC, help them deal with windows, help them deal with insulation in attics, all of those different things. If you just do the audit that says, hey, you got a problem in this building, and now we know why you have a $300 or $400 bill, but it doesn't fix the problem. That's where I think we need to really seriously consider think about a conservation program, which many other utilities have.
So as a matter of history, just to add, that was in fact done at one time here in Lake Worth. I did a little bit of research with a retiree who was involved with the program. The program ran from 2009 to 2012, approximately. There were about 5 or 6 staff that were added to manage the program. And the program had 2 elements to it. One was rebates for purchases of certain efficiency equipment, types of air conditioners, refrigerators, or hot water heaters, that type of stuff, light bulbs. And then the other aspect of the program was grants. The grants were used to offset the cost of installing energy conservation measures in a home, such as insulation in attics, window upgrades, air conditioning upgrades, things like that.
And that was based on need?
I believe that was a needs-based test at the time. And that program was funded by a surcharge on electric bills. The rebates came from FMPA because the city was in the all requirements project. However, we exited the all requirements project, my understanding, at the end of 2013. And I'm not even sure they still have the rebate program. So we'd have to come up with something similar. The grant program was funded by the surcharge on the electric bill. Information I got from staff that was that not all customers were happy with that. I don't know if that's entirely why the program was discontinued, but we are looking for the meetings of the minutes to try and determine, and anecdotal comments from folks that were around at the time, some of which may still be on the commission or members that bring us the history. But the grant program, of course, would have to be funded from someplace, right? And a rebate program. That can all be re-explored, but it was by a commission vote that it was discontinued in 2012. It doesn't mean that you can't vote to have a program. I'm not saying that that you can't.
But we'd have to find a way to fund it. I mean, we can't just, we're losing money. I you know, we have, so many people walk out on their electric, was it $300,000 a year we lose?
Combined
Or just-
water and electric, right?
Right. So I mean, how much can we give, honestly?
Well, we would suggest we could, you know, help to identify what type of a program might be of interest to the community, and then apply a cost basis to it, apply a rate impact model, a rate impact measure test, and bring that forward. But it does come up at a cost. Now, plenty of utilities do it. I'm not saying that, you know,
It's a discussion for tomorrow night, isn't it?
It's not on the agenda, is it?
no, it's not on the agenda for tomorrow night, but it can be brought forward at a future time to have that discussion. So again, this isn't something we're saying you can't do. We're saying it can be done. We just have to develop the program, define the, and then come up with the cost, and then the commission can decide how to proceed from there.
Yeah, the biggest thing that I want to make sure with this program is that we're, you know, I think right now, what the mayor might have been also talking about, we do offer people an audit. If they know that their electric bill's high because their house is energy efficient, then they call us.
Correct.
We'll go perform that audit. But if people think that their electric bill's high because they have Lake Worth Utilities, which is what most people think,
Right.
they don't take that step to get that audit. So I'm saying at a bare minimum, I want us to run the reports and say, which houses are using, you know, who's our top 5% of energy users in residential?
Right, that's a good idea.
Go after them.
Yeah, that's.
And then
I've been
once we
asking
get them, who's the
It's
next
still a
5%?
discussion for tomorrow.
since we came in. I think it's really important that we understand that, because that's where the perception comes from that Lake Worth is expensive. It's because people get a $300 or $400 bill, or I've even heard of much higher, which at our rates, that means that they're not using the industry standard of about 1,000 kilowatt hours a month. That means they're using 3,000 kilowatt hours a month. And we need to understand, well, why is that happening? And what are the points of influence to help change that back to a more reasonable usage?
True. So that's the staff that was once running that department has attrition down as once the program was stopped. But what was continued, as the commissioners have indicated, is the energy audit program. So today we still have 2 staff that are doing these energy audits. We do a few hundred, 200 to 300 per year, roughly, of these audits on the request of the customer. Some are really simple, some are more detailed. I know Commissioner McBoy has volunteered a lot of his time recently together with our staff to look at one particular customer who was in very, very dire straits. So thank you, Commissioner, for helping with that customer. But it was illustrative of the level of detail that you have to get into. And we collectively haven't been able to explain, why they're using so much energy in that particular house, because the insulation is proper. It appears that the windows are closed, the meters are registering correctly. But the point is that it takes a lot to get into these audits to help figure out just what is happening. And so far, the only conclusion we come to is that maybe a lot more people, a lot more usage in that home than we think to show why that bill is so high. They're also outside of the city limits. They're paying additional tax for the neighboring city. But the consumption, nonetheless, the consumption is still high. The point is that the audits continue, and that's built into our current rate structure, the concept of performing the audits. The assistance concept of providing grants or rebates, that's not in the current cost structure. We'd have to design that and determine what levels of customers would be eligible for that, and what would that mechanism look like, and then also appropriate controls to make sure that the money is being, properly managed and documented as to who it went to and why, with what kind of backup, audit proof.
And I totally agreed on the accountability. That's very important to it. And it's something that we could already do with the audits. We could look on the people on the buildings that we've done audits on and see, what was their usage before the audit? What was their usage afterwards? Did our audit help them out, or are we missing something? Are we missing a rebate? Those are some of the analyses that we need to start with, understanding what our usage distribution is like, and then start looking at what does it take to help get some of those down, so that we got to get rid of the reputation of being the most expensive, because it's damaging.
And Mr. McBoy, some people will hold on to that perception, give them the facts, and they just don't even care. So I mean, that's something that we also have to realize, is that this is the electric rates, the electric utility in Lake Worth is a pretty easy target for those people who are,
I agree with that perception, but I think doing the analysis of and being upfront of.
oh, I'm not suggesting we don't. I'm just
Yeah.
saying, I
That
don't
will
put too
help a
much
lot.
hope in. I don't put too much hope in a certain part of the population that is hell-bent on holding on to their negative perceptions.
So
Moving right along.
if I could circle us back to the Stantec discussion and kind of put a bow on it. For the past 4 years that I've been here, I've focused on cutting the expenses, restructuring the operation, obviously determining what level of capital we needed, where to deploy it first to get the best bang for the buck. We knew there would one day be rate increases. We've been operating we had 3 rate decreases. We're now cheaper at one level than the competitor for the residential customer. And because the competitor is going up, that's not why we should raise rates, right? We should only raise rates if we legitimately need the money to maintain an investment grade credit or even improve on it. So I do believe that in the first round of modeling, we thought we would wait until September of 22, or October of 22, which is start of fiscal 23. Based on the latest information and what we're seeing is we think it's prudent to look at that as early as January of 22. So about 9 months earlier than we expected. We've managed to forestall this by all of the cost cutting, and also in the getting the books straightened out and understanding the financials better with the work that finance is doing. This is part of the work that Bruce and his team have helped to get done, plus us running our own financials month to month to see where we're at. So we do think that January is the time to act and to act decisively. And I think that we should be on that, get ourselves on a path that says, hey, by fiscal 25, fiscal 26, we would be at that 180-day limit. And I remind the commission, and I say remind because not everybody may be aware of this, we operate without a storm fund. So we don't have a separate pot of money called hurricane fund. When we get hit by a storm, and since I've arrived here in the last 4 years, we've spent about $5 million as a city just on supporting the electric utility on storms, some of it from the utility and some of it from the insurance funds. But we've absorbed $5 million, and you say, well, how'd you spend $5 million, right? And those were, one category 4, category 5 that hovered just 80 miles to the east of us for a week while we had staff here ready to go. And then there was Irma at the end of 2017. So it doesn't take much of a storm to hit $2 to $5 million in expense. And you can look at that working capital number and say, uh-oh, we get hit with a storm. And, hopefully, knock on wood, we don't. But we're running close to the edge. So we really need to work on getting those balances up.
I think that's unnecessary. So here we go. What's up?
Okay, are we ready to talk about water? On
Yes.
the next enterprise. So the next slide, here we have the water fund, and I will mention that most of these look very similar to our last discussion, not a lot of change. So this forecast similarly, there's no increase proposed for the water rates in fiscal year 22. And we are holding the forecasted increases that we had looked at last year, which was 3.75. As we talked about last time, we are showing a buildup of cash balance within the water fund. And so the likelihood that if things play out, you may not need to do a rate increase next year. But again, you've evaluated this on an annual basis. You can see that over the long term of the forecast period, you would be starting eating into your balance even with those increases. But that does assume that you move really to a pay-go basis in the outer years. So you can see the bottom CIP funding graph in the middle down there where the green bars start showing up. That's assuming that you just move to a pay-go approach in that future period, that you would be doing borrowing between now and then.
So the revenue versus expenses graph is fascinating. Both in and out have about the same slope, but right around 26, something goes crazy.
Yep.
What is that?
That's the pay-go. So basically you can see the two graphs, the one below it really tells you what's happening. So all of a sudden in 2027, you're now shifting to pay-go funding capital. And so the expenses go up. The orange line zigs up in the upper graph. So that now that your expenses and cash out are now greater than your cash in, which causes your fund balance to start dropping. Does that make sense?
And so tell us more of why would one want to make that change? Is one making that change because sooner or later you have to, or external things?
Yeah, part of it is the fact that as a utility, and I think this was mentioned earlier, that to some degree, as you move towards a long-term sustainability, would be to have some amount of pay-go funding that takes place, because you don't want to continually be adding more and more leverage on the system. And to get to more of a sustainable basis would be to say, well, if we're able to fund some of our capital from recurring revenues, that gets us to more of a long-term sustainability. However, there's communities that argue that no, these are long-lived assets. We should always be borrowing for these assets. Then the payment of those assets, paying off the debt and the useful life of the assets then match. So there are arguments either way. I would say there's one silver bullet. You generally don't want to be borrowing for short-lived assets,
Right.
Less than 10 years or so. But you certainly have the ability to consider more debt funding in the outer years.
So the shift that we see in the middle two graphs, the upper and lower revenue versus expenses up and funding below, that change in 26, 27 is that we shift to less external borrowing and more internal paying it out of the revenue stream.
Exactly.
And
that's just
one of the things that pops out to me looking at the working capital fund, the upper left, we're building up, we're well above the reserves. So that's cool. That's great. That's positive. But we're building up for quite a while. Could you not feather that so that you don't build up so much excess and smooth the blue bars out a bit more?
Yep.
Which would presumably mean at least the transition in 26, 27 would be less of a jump.
Yes.
The overall numbers probably wouldn't change a whole lot, I don't guess.
Exactly. Yep.
My bigger concern, and I don't know if our water director's on the line or not, is, we've talked about the fact that our water rates are already way too high. So when I see this, it doesn't make me feel warm and fuzzy because I already know that our water rates are too high and we need to bring them down to be compatible with the surrounding communities. Now, is this only residential? Because I see where it says single family home or single family bill. So this is not including our residential water rates?
No, that would be
our commercial? This is
an
only,
increase. This is an across the board increase.
I don't think we have separate commercial and residential water.
okay, because here it says average single family bill.
Yeah,
So I don't know if
that's
this is pertaining to,
Just for reporting purposes.
Okay.
This shows a typical single family bill.
so just by seeing this, I'm already not in favor because I know where our water rates are, which is why a lot of the perception that Mr. McBoy was speaking about, when people get their bill, they automatically blame the electric department, but it's not. It's coupled with sewer and refuse. So I understand the ability that we need to have the 6 months target, but I'm not in favor of a 3.75 increase when we're already not anywhere near our. Do you have a comparison chart of what our rates are compared to everybody else?
Yeah.
I'm sure I knew you would. I already knew the
But
answer.
I think we also, I agree with you that it's uncomfortable to be higher than other communities. But the other side of it is whatever our costs are to operate the thing and provide the water, that's a pretty big driving force. And you can say, well, I want our water rates to be lower, but if that means that we're, basically that's what we did in the electric. Over the last 10 years, we said, we're gonna drive our rates down and get below, a reasonable goal. We didn't achieve that goal in the perception, but we did in the reality. We brought the rates down. We did that by sucking down our reserves, was a big chunk of that. In this one, in water, we've been more responsible fiscally that our rates are pretty tied to our expenses. I think Brian would probably agree with that. He can certainly correct me. And Probably part of that is that we are paying some of the capital on having an RO plant, which is expandable, which, and everybody's going to wind up on RO in South Florida eventually. We were smart and got there earlier because you're going to have saltwater intrusion bothering all of your wells, and we'll shift over to RO. That's probably a chunk of why we're a little more.
No, and I agree with you that, I mean, we can't lose money, but we also don't need to be, utilities for municipalities are supposed to be a service. They're not supposed to be a revenue generating force.
Exactly. And
So-
that's why that argument that we were talking about earlier, that, oh, well, let's get more residents in and they'll use more water.
But at the same time, we
It-
can't punish the residents or the potential business owners that are coming in when they're looking at us versus surrounding municipalities, which I'm sure we'll see soon, and doing a cost assessment. Yeah, we've got great quality water and we all enjoy it, but commercial, at the same time, we need to be mindful that water,
Sure.
again, like we said, is something that's a life need,
But it's- And the
Sorry.
cost of it should be reflected in conservation. I mean, we can manufacture electricity, we can't manufacture water. And I don't mind it being an expense that people will consider conserving.
rain barrels for everybody.
Yeah, I guess just as a circle back, if we were to come back next year and the picture looked like this, we wouldn't be recommending 3.75 next year. That's essentially, you do reevaluate this every year. It does look like you're building up balance. To Commissioner McBoy's point, you could argue that you're in a good position now, and therefore you've done the work, in terms of investments in the system. Maybe that's why you're more expensive. Financially, you're in a solid position. So maybe where you don't have to raise rates for a number of years. But I do agree that it's difficult to compare community to community, because there are communities that are not investing in their systems and they're running on a shoestring and they're going to fall apart and they're going to have to raise their rates 50%.
It may be a big jump.
I just caution, we always caution you don't want to lower rates, because generally it just gets you back in the position where you're going to have to raise them. And the community is more pissed off when you raise them than they are happy when you lower them. And so to the extent that you're running a good system, which we believe you are, you're making the investments, you have good balances, most likely you're not going to have to raise rates for a number of years. That's a very positive position to be in.
Could we look at, since you've got the model there, instead of the flat across the board 3.75 starting in 23, could we look at, say, 2% starting in 23 and see what that looks like to these graphs?
Go up to watermelon.
That's the cool part about what Stantec does, is that you can ask those kind of questions.
While you're in there, can you
Thank you,
tell us the
Sal.
price of gold and what fuel's going to be in 6 months from now? Can you predict that for us?
2% every year? Is that what we want to see?
I don't know, I picked it out of the air. It's smaller than
Or
3.75.
cut 1.7, cut 3.75 in half? Let me see where you're going.
So what this is doing now, and could you hit the zoom button maybe, Ralph?
It's interesting, so
Yeah. The way that the model works is we have the ability to force it to borrow if you come to your target. And so what this is doing is it's saying, okay, we're building up some cash balance. We're starting to pay-go fund in 2027, but we reach our minimum target by 2030. And therefore the model's now saying, oh, we don't have any more money. We're below our target. So let's borrow. And so it has that ability to.
which is what the two black bars
Exactly.
are.
Yep. And so we could go ahead and if Ralph went in there and put in 1% instead of 2%. I think Brian's probably getting nervous. So now we would get to the point where we can't borrow enough and we would fall below our target in 2031. But we're still building up that some cash balance. And so that is the dynamic nature of the model. And again, it's something that would be reevaluated next year.
So it says franchise fee of revenue was 10% this year? Is that, or in fiscal year 2021? That water paid 10%?
I think it was, and it's brought down to 8% in 22, given the budget. So we're now moving to 8% for all funds.
Right. It wouldn't be a bad idea if we could get hard copies of the 375, the 2 and the 1, just for us to be able to,
Sure.
you know, think about those that,
And the other thing we could do is you could potentially reduce your borrowing in the near term a little bit, which would keep you from building up such a balance and maybe have, you know, if you wanted to do just a 1% increase.
move to feather in the pay-go a little bit more,
Yeah.
a little earlier. I heard somebody groan. Somebody
Who
didn't
goes,
like that idea.
That was Brian.
That was just me with a deep sigh, that's all.
All right. So we're good here. Well, and we'd be happy to run those scenarios if we could provide you.
I think, I mean, I totally agree with Commissioner Malega that it's not comfortable to be hugely different than your neighbors, but you also want to be looking at the picture and are we managing this wisely? And sometimes you may have neighbors that are not, as you pointed out, and
Right.
they look good now, but their future model might look pretty terrible.
I just have a quick question about this tool and everything else. Does Brian have the ability, as he's making decisions of, do we want to take out a loan versus pay as I go? Because right now everything's so abstract, it's all futuristic based on a bunch of assumptions. And for me, some of this stuff would feel more helpful at like point of use when you're deciding, do I pay go or do I borrow? So do we come back to you when we're trying to make those decisions?
Yeah, that's generally how it's worked.
Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Brian started using Stantec in the water utilities years before we started using it in general.
Yeah.
So, and I will say this, FY22, as we get into October into the fall and early, 2022 calendar year, because of the potential for having a lot of various conversations about rates, it probably would become a commonplace where we have David and Stantec here at subsequent meetings. So this isn't all just shoved through in the budget process, month 6 in the office. Now you've got settled. Now you've seen this. You've gone through a budget process. So the Commissioner Stokes point, you'll probably start seeing modeling and these opportunities to have these conversations on a more regular basis as we encounter these different conversations along the timeline in FY22 and moving forward. Because they're extremely helpful.
Yeah, they're very helpful to look out a ways, how to fund balances, the things that Bruce is helping us focus on. Got to pay attention to those fund balances and look at the trends as we make decisions. Are we headed for the rocks? Or are we doing pretty well?
Okay, so next is the sewer fund. So we'll flip over to that. Next slide, Ralph. Next one. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, so sewer fund, the trajectory is really more, we're trying to keep revenues in line with expenditures. So this one does have a 3.25, nothing in this year, but 3.25 next year. And that really keeps us at revenues and expenditures aligned. So you can see in the middle graph, the black line, cash in, cash out, are the same. We're trying to maintain that 6 months reserve target. We are borrowing for the entire CIP, so it's $14.2 million in borrowing over the 10-year period. So no pay-go there. If we pay-goed more, we would see more of a hit to the fund. But this one's really just trying to keep sewer in line at that inflationary cost increase level.
And presumably part of the reason for not doing as much pay-go is most of these investments, the borrowing for these investments is for sewer lines that you have an expected, who knows, 30-year, 40-year, 50-year lifespan on them.
Very long-lived assets.
Yeah.
Yep.
Fortunately, we're not in the seismic area.
Correct. So next slide has the comparison that was alluded to earlier. So this is the 2021 rates, 5,000 gallons. So this would be a single family typical monthly usage. You can see the water and sewer bill, $82. I think I mentioned this last time, but should be mentioned again that These are current rates, and this is what the bill will be through the next fiscal year in Lake Worth Beach. These other communities may be raising rates, as a lot of communities do. So it's somewhat of an apples to oranges comparison. And we don't know yet exactly what their rates are going to be. So just need to keep that in mind, but you can say the bill is towards the right, as was mentioned. But to the extent that water is kept constant, over time, that may shift to be more towards the middle of the day.
And something that we can point out, if we've been watching the newspaper for the last 3 months, West Palm Beach had to shut things down for a while because their water supply is surface water, and they had harmful algae blooms that knocked them out pretty hard. And in that vein, Brian likes this one, I suspect. Palm Beach buys its water from West Palm Beach, and I believe they're thinking of perhaps buying it from us because we're not subject to harmful algae blooms because of the RO and our shallow surface water. So we may be to the right, but we have some quality aspects that other places don't necessarily have.
Yeah, this is Brian. That's correct. The town of Palm Beach is evaluating their options for when their contract expires with the city of West Palm Beach. So we are in that game.
When does that expire?
More like the Maserati.
A year?
No, years.
2029, but you're looking at a 5-year window of planning and construction. So they're evaluating their options as we speak.
Okay, we have 2 more funds. Next fund is the stormwater fund. And so projections again here are similar. We could do similar analysis as we did on water, but essentially what we're showing is you do have a very healthy fund balance, working capital at the beginning here.
It's going down.
And we are showing that it is being drawn down. We're showing 3% increases in future years. And the reason it's being drawn down is we are forecasting that you'd be cash funding your capital. And so you can see the cash out is higher than the cash in each year. And so we would be drawing down on the balance. You could potentially look at borrowing if you wanted to stabilize things. But it's a little bit less common to borrow on the stormwater side because the assets don't necessarily last quite as long. And I don't
Is
know.
that without a rate increase? I'm sorry, is that without a rate increase, that working capital fund chart?
That's with,
No, that's
the rate.
Yeah, that's 3% increase. Yeah.
And something that occurs to me looking at that graph, the blue bars dropping down, is it fair to say, and I guess maybe this is almost a question for Brian, that could you have a similar graph for the same time period that was the, I don't know, miles or feet of new stormwater pipe, say, or some other measure of what we're accumulating that has a lifespan to it? It may not be 30 years, but it's certainly longer than 10, I would think, that as our capital fund is going down, we are building a fund of infrastructure. Is that a valid way to look at that, Brian?
Yes, Commissioner, that's a valid point. But I will say most of the stormwater improvements are more resiliency related, sea level rise, king tide issues, work along the intercoastal, and a lot of these capital projects will be funded by grant funding. We are pursuing a lot of grants, which also helps the financial picture.
And we came in first in the one with Palm Beach County, as I recollect, was one of your.
That's correct. We appreciate your assistance on that and the whole commission's support of the Lake Worth Lagoon Initiative.
I didn't do much, but staff did a good job.
Yeah, Brian brings up a great point. You do get significant grant funding in 2021. And so hopefully
I think steadily, actually,
Yeah.
we're always looking on that
the
one.
picture will look different. And so therefore, again, I'm coming back next year for an interim point. It may be that we wouldn't recommend any increases in 22. I'm sorry, 23. So the next slide shows just a comparison. And we now added in the Lake Worth Drainage District fee, $49.50 to give us
A fair comparison.
fair comparison. So and this is an annual stormwater fee for residential customers. So you're at
Oh, look at it, right.
78.25. And again, this may not reflect future rates or going into this next fiscal year because we don't know what these communities potentially are going to do with the stormwater fees. So the last fund is the refuse fund. This one looks fairly similar, but there is one nuance to it. We did run a scenario here where staff asked us to look at transferring $1.5 million out in fiscal 22 for a capital project. And so you can see there is a bump up in the cash out happens in 22 for that transfer out. You can see your working capital reserve does drop in 22 just because of that transfer out. But you're still solid in terms of the refuse rates in that we don't project a need for an increase until 2028. And so, given how things change, potentially in the future, you may not need to make that change, but that's what we're forecasting at this point. You need to do about 3% in 2028, and then some modest increases in future years.
My question is the franchise fee, if we're gonna be 8%, how come we're not showing the 8%? We go from 8.9 to 7.5, I mean, we're kind of, wouldn't it just be 8 across the board? To look at real numbers? If that's what our policy is going towards?
Yeah, if that's what you're, what is it showing, 7.5?
Yeah, but none of them have shown 8. I mean, if we're really gonna adopt this, I would like to see us here and say 8%, we're committing, this is what we're doing. So we see, worst case, best case scenario in the future.
Yeah, I know we dropped it to make sure it matched the budget in 22, but we'll make sure we can provide all these forecasts with the 8% as a fixed amount going forward, if that's going to be adopted policy.
Seem like.
I mean, I guess it would help me make a decision if it should be adopted policy or not.
I agree. I noticed the same thing, that a number of them they were close to 8, but they bounced around some.
Yeah, we can do that.
And I think there's quite a bit of enthusiasm on the dais to say, yes, let's do the 8 and let's hold it constant. So that seems like a reasonable thing to put in the model.
So I think our final slide is the garbage and recycling fee comparison. So $245 per year, 14 cents. See how you compare it to others. And given the forecast, that wouldn't change until well out into the future, 2028, 2029. So it should be that's going to be the fee for some period of time.
What's the asterisk?
So it doesn't include the disposal fee of $173 that's paid to Palm Beach County.
Oh, that's on the property taxes, I think, or something?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Is that basically a tipping fee? And it's just flat for everybody?
I believe it is, yeah.
And none of those other communities are outsourcing.
Looks like perhaps, is Jamie Brown on?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm on. Jamie Brown, Public Works Director. Commissioner Robinson, yes, that's correct.
That none of them are outsourcing, or some of them are, or?
That is correct. The ones on the screen right now perform their own services, just as we do.
So it's comparable. And are all of the other ones also paying the 173? Everybody pays that?
In Palm Beach County.
Correct, except what you see below, other than the Deerfield Beach and Coral Springs, and that is the tipping fees.
And we're trying to figure out how to charge Deerfield Beach, but we're not there yet. And that just, I think it's obvious, but that's an annual 245.
Correct.
That gets
That
all.
is correct. That's what's shown on your ad tax each year.
And Jamie, does this 245, that's garbage, recycling, and the vegetation?
Correct. So this amount that you're looking at, the 245.14, this is for the residential services in the city. Commercial is what actually falls under our fee schedule, because that is dependent upon the quantity of collection weekly for our commercial businesses.
And that also includes 1 monthly bulk pickup.
That is correct as well.
No, for the residential.
Oh, for the resident. Yeah, no, I mean, it's hard to value things, but when you think of all the stuff that you can get out of your house that would fill you up pretty quickly, and Jamie makes it go away, whether it's vegetation, recycle, or
Or
garbage,
essentially $12 a month,
for $2.45, whatever, yeah.
$12 a month.
Yeah, so that's the two collections
Good
for
deal.
your residential garbage each week as far as vegetation 3 months out of the or 3 weeks out of the
Garbage
year.
each side.
Another
Garbage
one.
side.
Thank you, Jamie.
That's not including, like you said, the green pickup and
It's a big deal. You have to deal with that yourself.
call 1-800-GOT-JUNK and see how much they charge.
I'll run that.
Right?
Yeah.
Just for their commercials to be aired.
So I think that's it. We've got last slide. Yep. So that concludes the presentation. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And you'll be able to email us hard copies of,
Yes.
awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nice robust conversation this evening.
Really?
I'll open the floor up one more time for Mr. Miller. Do you have any closing remarks? Or anyone on the dais?
Can we just go through next steps real quick?
What is the next step?
Oh, no.
Well, thank you. The next steps, number one, we have 2 budget hearings that are coming up. They will be a little bit, they'll provide the same information on the operating budgets that you received tonight. So those 2 public hearings and the final adoption at the end of that process, I think is the 23rd, I might be incorrect. And then part for that sequence, the capital budget will be also introduced as a, and driving back on the capital budget. It will be the enterprise funds, and then assuming that everybody is in agreement, we'll discuss the general fund and the other governmental funds in early October, after there's a thorough conversation on the different revenue sources and what to do with those revenue sources. As part of the capital budget, the presentation, not knowing that we were going to do such a deep dive into the capital worksheets this afternoon, I was remiss to get into too much detail and explain the schedule in detail and how it flows. Really, generally, it's a 5-year plan with a first year of the plan being appropriated. That's the legal authority to spend the dollars. There are several items in the 5-year plan that come up in fiscal year 22 for appropriation, but have already, for example, the computer equipment, the IT budget. There are dollars in that budget that were approved as part of the borrowing authority, but were not part of the prior year appropriation. So for fiscal year, we appropriate in fiscal year, we appropriate in fiscal year 22, 23, 24, 25, et cetera. Those already have a dedicated funding source. They were part of the borrowing. It's just a formality to bring forward and to appropriate. So when you look at the total of $13 million, there's a funding source. They've been approved, but they are part of the $13 million summation. So there might be a disconnect between what's been already approved, what's not been approved, what has a borrowing authority, what has a funding source, et cetera, et cetera. But it's my way, if you will, to keep track of the different buckets and most importantly, the legal authority, i.e. the appropriation that goes with it. So there might be some confusion with that, and we'll get a little bit more detail. Another example There are projects, you have to understand that one of the problems as far as a municipality is concerned is identifying all the projects that may or may not need to be funded. This is a request and projects that are identified by the different departments, but the priorities and needs and how you rank those, if it's safety, an emergency, a legal mandate, there are different ways that communities go through a ranking process. And not to say that all these projects that are in front of you at the $13 million are going to be funded or intended to be funded. They are really a presentation as to what the department directors think should be funded. Ultimately, it's your decision to rank them. There are different ranking, and I'll be happy to share with you the GFOA's parameters. I might have shared that with you already, but I can send that out to you as to how government municipalities rank different capital projects. So there's a whole host of different criteria. If you want it simplified or detailed, it's all there. So that is, I think, the most important step is having that policy conversation relative to the different funding sources, and then moving the capital appropriation in October. So, Madam Mayor, I hope I provided you enough detail on the next steps. If I was decision making, let me know, but
No, I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
high level.
It's been an interesting evening.
Yes.
I do have one question, Madam Mayor. Under sales tax, under source of funds, that is where we bonded out funds against the penny sales tax that was coming in, correct? Okay, thank you.
And I think you're looking at the IT computer equipment for that.
I'm just looking at all of it, the whole line. Grapple trucks, all kinds of stuff.
Madam Mayor, that's it. And from a staff's perspective, this evening with the budget workshop, and then reminder, we have a closed door session tomorrow at 5, followed by an electric utility board meeting at 6 o'clock.
Yep.
And,
Sounds like fun.
And again,
Fun never stops in Lake Worth Beach. Madam Clerk, I have a question for you. We have some sort of presentation being done tomorrow, and I'm wondering, I'm unaware of any backup that we have received on that.
Tomorrow night, I just received it. I can email it to you
Okay, thank you.
in the morning.
Okay, go home. Do I have a motion?
We don't need one.
workshop, Madam
I
Mayor.
keep getting that wrong. But I figure, in the abundance of caution, I would ask for it. So
No harm in that.
staff, thank you very much, staff. Thank you, fellow commissioners.
Yes, yes.
Thought-provoking questions. We've got a lot to think about, and hopefully I'm going to be back in person in the next, I'm hoping this is the last week. I'm feeling a lot better. I'm just really now just in the abundance of caution, staying home for another couple of days. I'm told that even though I am testing positive, it's just something that is in my system, and I'm going to get a doctor's note that says I can rejoin the world. Because I am just so bored. I have not left the house in 2 weeks.
Oh, man.
No, it's crazy. And I've had no energy to really do any projects around the house. So it's really been, I nap a lot, and that's not my style. I appreciate everybody's patience with me. Have a great night, everybody.
Get healthy.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much.